Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. When I was 16, my family moved into an old Victorian house on the edge of town. The house was huge, with high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a towering attic that smelled like dust and forgotten memories. My parents said it was a fixer-upper, but to me, it felt like stepping into a different time. A time where secrets hid in the shadows and whispers lingered in the air. At first, everything was normal. We spent days unpacking boxes, painting walls, and arguing about where the furniture should go. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed the noises. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. A faint creak, like someone was walking slowly down the hallway outside my room. I froze, my heart racing. Our house was old, sure, but I knew the sound of footsteps when I heard them. I called out, "Mom? Dad?" No answer. I tiptoed to the door, opened it, and peeked out. The hallway was empty, the only light coming from a small nightlight plugged into the wall. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably the house settling or the wind rattling the old windows. But the noises didn't stop. The next night, I heard faint knocking. 3 slow, deliberate taps coming from the wall near my bed. I sat up, holding my breath. The knocks came again, louder this time. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the wall. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling foolish. Silence. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they just laughed it off. "Old houses make noises," my dad said, sipping his coffee. My mom nodded. "It's probably the pipes," she added. But I wasn't convinced. Over the next few weeks, the sounds grew more frequent and more unsettling. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways, doors creaked open on their own, and sometimes, late at night, I'd hear what sounded like faint whispers. I tried recording the noises on my phone, but they never seemed to pick up on the audio. It was as if the sounds didn't want to be captured. One night, I decided I'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight and more courage than sense, I ventured into the attic, where most of the noises seemed to come from. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed up, each step feeling like a question. "Are you sure you want to do this?" The attic was cold, colder than the rest of the house. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the room with my flashlight. It was filled with old furniture, dusty trunks, and cobwebs that clung to the beams like forgotten dreams. Everything looked still, untouched. But then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like someone moving across the floorboards. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. The shuffling stopped. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the attic, behind an old wardrobe, there was a small door I'd never noticed before. It was barely big enough for a child to crawl through. The wood was warped and splintered, and the handle was rusted. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, dark passageway. The air smelled damp, and I could feel a cold draft coming from somewhere deep inside. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But curiosity won. I crawled inside, dragging the flashlight with me. The passage led to a small room, no bigger than a closet. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in the center of the room was a small wooden chair. On the floor next to the chair was a collection of objects: a broken doll, a stack of yellowed papers, and a rusted tin box. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside were photographs of children, their faces pale and expressionless, and a handwritten note that simply read, "They're always watching." I scrambled out of the passageway, my mind racing. Who were the children? And why was this hidden room here? I didn't sleep that night, every creak and whisper making my skin crawl. The next morning, I showed the photographs to my parents. Their faces went pale. My mom admitted she'd found similar things while cleaning the house but hadn't wanted to scare me. My dad tried to brush it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Things only got worse after that. The noises became louder, more aggressive. Furniture would move on its own, and the whispers turned into cries. One night, I woke up to find the words "Get out" scratched into the paint on my bedroom wall. That was the last straw. We moved out a month later, leaving behind the fixer-upper and all its secrets. To this day, I don't know who or what was making those noises. Sometimes I dream about the attic, the hidden room, and the whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves. I always wake up with the same feeling. Some stories are better left untold. When I was 14, my family moved into a rambling old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house had stood empty for years, its paint peeling and its windows clouded with grime. My parents saw potential in its sprawling yard and rustic charm, but to me, it felt eerie from the moment we arrived. Something about it seemed alive. The first week was uneventful. My brothers and I explored the property, climbing the gnarled oak trees and daring each other to run through the overgrown fields. At night, I would lie in bed, lulled to sleep by the sound of crickets chirping outside. But that calm didn't last long. One evening, after dinner, I went down to the cellar to grab a can of soda. The cellar was dark and damp, the kind of place you'd expect to find spiders the size of your hand. I flicked on the light, a single bulb that barely lit the space, and started down the creaky wooden stairs. Halfway down, I froze. There it was, a faint, muffled sound. It was soft, almost like someone crying. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. The crying stopped. I stood there for a moment, every hair on my body standing on end, before shaking it off and grabbing the soda. When I told my parents, they dismissed it as my imagination. "Old houses have strange acoustics," my dad said. "Sound travels in weird ways." But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. The crying always started just after dark, faint and distant at first, but it grew louder the longer I listened. It seemed to come from somewhere deep in the cellar, beyond the reach of the light. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I decided to investigate. I crept down the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The crying was louder now, unmistakable. It sounded like a child, sobbing softly. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, just the sound of crying, more pitiful than ever. The sound seemed to be coming from behind an old wooden shelf lined with dusty jars. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the shelf aside, revealing a narrow doorway. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open to reveal a small, hidden room. The air inside was cold, so cold I could see my breath. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, and in the center of the room was an old crib. The crying stopped the moment I stepped inside. The silence was deafening. I shone the flashlight around the room, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it. A tiny handprint smeared on the wall, as if a child had pressed their hand into the dirt and left their mark. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and bolted up the stairs. I told my parents what I'd found, but they dismissed it as a prank. My dad even went down to the cellar to check. When he came back, he said there was no hidden room, just a solid stone wall behind the shelf. "You've been watching too many scary movies," he said with a laugh. But I knew what I'd seen. The crying continued every night, growing louder and more desperate. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, too, faint and indistinct, like someone trying to speak through water. My grades started to slip because I couldn't sleep. My friends noticed how tired I looked, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Who would believe me? One night, I decided to record the sounds on my phone. I set it up in the cellar and left it running overnight. The next morning, I played the recording back. At first, all I could hear was the faint sound of the crying. But then, about halfway through, a voice spoke. It was low and raspy, and it sent chills down my spine. "Leave," it said. I showed the recording to my brothers, who both turned pale. Even my parents couldn't explain it. My dad tried to laugh it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. My mom's hands shook as she held the phone. Things escalated after that. Objects in the house started moving on their own. Lights flickered, and doors slammed shut without warning. One night, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom door to the foot of my bed. I barely slept after that, too afraid to close my eyes. One evening, my youngest brother, Ethan, came running upstairs, his face white as a sheet. He said he'd seen a figure in the cellar, a little girl in a torn dress, standing by the old wooden shelf. My parents finally decided it was time to do something. They called in a local historian, who told us that the farmhouse had a dark history. Decades ago, a family had lived there with a young daughter named Lila. One winter, she'd gone missing, and despite weeks of searching, her body was never found. Some people said she'd fallen into the nearby river, while others whispered that something more sinister had happened. Hearing this only made the crying in the cellar more chilling. My parents decided to move, and within a month, we were gone. I never went back to the house, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of crying in my dreams. I don't know if it was Lila or something else entirely, but one thing is certain, that house wasn't just old. It was haunted by a sadness so deep, it echoed through its very walls. And no matter how far away I am, a part of me will always wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone to hear her cries. I never believed in ghosts until we moved into that old house. My dad called it quaint. My mom said it was full of character, but I only saw peeling wallpaper, flickering lights, and an unsettling amount of dark corners. We moved in during the winter, and from the moment we arrived, the house felt cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many sweaters you wore. The first strange thing happened on our second night there. I was in my room unpacking a box of books when I heard a soft thud. It sounded like it came from downstairs. My first thought was that it was Dad. He'd been moving furniture around all day. But when I stepped out of my room to look, I saw him sitting in the living room with Mom, both of them engrossed in some home renovation show on TV. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Dad replied without looking away from the screen. "A noise. It sounded like something fell." Mom smiled. "This house is old, sweetheart. It's probably just settling." I wanted to believe her, but something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, I started noticing more noises. Soft footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, faint scratching sounds coming from behind the walls, and an occasional faint humming that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. One evening, I was helping Mom in the kitchen when the overhead light began to flicker. The bulb buzzed, dimmed, and then went out completely. Mom groaned, grabbed a flashlight, and told me to fetch Dad. "He's in the basement checking the fuse box," she said. The basement was one place I hadn't explored yet, and for good reason. The door was old and warped, and the stairs leading down were narrow and steep. A damp, musty smell wafted up every time the door opened. Still, I didn't want to seem scared, so I grabbed my own flashlight and made my way down. "Dad," I called as I reached the bottom. The basement was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, casting long shadows across the room. Old tools and boxes were piled everywhere, and the concrete floor was cracked in places. "Over here," Dad's voice came from the far corner. As I walked toward him, I noticed something odd. One of the shadows on the wall didn't match the objects in the room. It was too tall, too human-like. I stopped, shining my flashlight at the wall, but the shadow remained, even though there was nothing there to cast it. My stomach churned. "Dad, do you see that?" I asked, pointing. "See what?" He turned to look, but by then, the shadow had disappeared. "Never mind," I muttered, backing away toward the stairs. That night, the noises grew louder. I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my room. My heart pounded as I listened, too scared to get out of bed. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped, and the house fell silent. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked my parents if they'd heard anything. They shook their heads, but I could tell they were uneasy. Dad even joked about the house being haunted, though his laugh sounded forced. The real turning point came a week later. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was home alone while my parents ran errands. I was sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework, when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. My first instinct was to run outside and wait for my parents, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a broom, my makeshift weapon, and crept upstairs. The sound had come from my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw that their mirror had fallen off the wall, shattering into pieces on the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. Scrawled across the wall in jagged, dark letters were the words, "Leave now." My hands shook as I backed out of the room. I bolted downstairs, grabbed my phone, and called my mom. When she and Dad got home, the writing was gone. The mirror was still broken, but the wall was blank, as if nothing had happened. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the house. The noises grew more frequent and more deliberate. One night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when the faucet turned on by itself, the water running full blast. Another time, I came home from school to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open, even though no one else had been home. The worst incident happened a few weeks later. I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a low whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from beneath my bed. "Get out," the voice hissed. I screamed and bolted out of my room, running straight to my parents' room. They let me sleep on their floor that night, though they still insisted it was all in my head. Eventually, my parents started to experience strange things, too. My mom claimed she'd seen a shadow move across the living room, even though no one was there. My dad heard what sounded like children laughing in the middle of the night, though my younger siblings were fast asleep. We finally decided to have the house checked by a paranormal investigator. He was an older man with a calm demeanor and a lot of strange equipment. He spent hours walking through the house, muttering to himself and taking readings. When he finished, he sat us down in the living room. "There's definitely something here," he said. "It's not malevolent, but it's restless. Something happened in this house, something unresolved." He suggested we smudge the house with sage and consider moving if things didn't improve. My parents followed his advice, and for a while, the noises stopped. But the feeling of unease never went away. A few months later, we moved out. The new house was smaller and less full of character, but it felt safe. Still, I can't forget the things that happened in that old house. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint creak or a whisper, and my heart will race. Part of me wonders if whatever was in that house followed us. But another part of me doesn't want to know. When we first moved into the house, I thought it was perfect. It was an old, sprawling two-story with a big porch and a huge backyard. A dream come true for my mom, who'd always wanted a historic home. The place needed some work, sure, but my parents were excited about the project. I wasn't. There was something about the house that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The first night, as we were unpacking boxes, I noticed a strange sound coming from upstairs. It was faint but steady, like a rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was my younger brother, Jake, messing around, but when I went to check, I found him in the living room with Mom, setting up the TV. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Mom replied without looking up. "Never mind," I muttered, brushing it off as old house noises. But as the days passed, the noises grew more frequent and harder to ignore. Tapping, scratching, and sometimes faint whispers seemed to echo through the walls. The sounds were worse at night, often keeping me awake. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and groan like it was alive. One night, I swore I heard someone humming a lullaby outside my door. When I opened it, no one was there. I told my parents, but they laughed it off. "Old houses make noises," Dad said. "It's probably the pipes." One evening, while exploring the house, I stumbled upon something strange. At the end of the upstairs hallway, hidden behind a heavy bookcase, was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small and painted the same color as the wall, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the bookcase aside and opening the door. Inside was a tiny, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that looked like it had been there for decades. In the center of the room was a wooden rocking chair, and next to it, a small table with a single candle. The air was heavy, carrying a faint smell of mildew. My skin prickled as I stepped inside. The room felt wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The air was colder than the rest of the house, and there was a strange pressure, like the room itself didn't want me there. I quickly left, pulling the door shut behind me and shoving the bookcase back into place. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I woke up to the sound of the rocking chair creaking, as if someone was sitting in it and gently rocking back and forth. The sound sent chills down my spine. I buried my head under the covers and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I told Jake about the hidden room. His eyes lit up with curiosity, and he insisted we go back to check it out. Reluctantly, I agreed. Together, we moved the bookcase and opened the door. The room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The rocking chair was now facing the door, as if someone had been sitting in it, waiting for us. Creepy, Jake said with a nervous laugh. Maybe it's the wind, but there was no wind. The air in the room was still heavy. We didn't stay long. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own, even when the windows were closed. Lights flickered, and objects seemed to move on their own. One night, I woke up to find my desk chair pulled into the middle of my room, though I was sure I'd left it by the wall. Another time, Jake swore he heard someone whisper his name while he was brushing his teeth. The worst incident happened late one night when I was home alone. I was in my room, trying to do homework, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the rocking chair creaking again. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the hallway. The bookcase was still in place, but the creaking was louder now, echoing through the house. Summoning every ounce of courage, I moved the bookcase and opened the door. The rocking chair was moving, slowly, back and forth, though there was no one in the room. On the table, the candle was lit, its flame flickering as if disturbed by an unseen breath. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I slammed the door shut and ran downstairs, my hands shaking. When my parents came home, I told them everything. To my surprise, they didn't dismiss it. My mom admitted she felt uneasy in the house ever since we moved in, and Dad said he'd heard strange noises, too, though he tried to ignore them. The next day, we called a contractor to inspect the house. He found something strange in the walls behind the hidden room, a small, sealed-off space containing old toys, photographs, and a diary. The diary belonged to a girl named Clara, who had lived in the house decades ago. The final entry read, "I hear them calling my name. They won't let me leave." After that, my parents decided we couldn't stay. Within a month, we packed up and moved to a new house across town. The new place is smaller and not as fancy, but it's quiet, blissfully quiet. Still, I can't stop thinking about that hidden room and the things we found there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the faint creak of a rocking chair in my dreams. And when I wake up, I'm never quite sure if it was just a dream or something more. When my grandparents passed away, the family decided to sell their old farmhouse. Before putting it on the market, my mom suggested we spend a week there cleaning it out. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The house had always creeped me out as a kid, with its narrow hallways, dark wood paneling, and a constant draft that made it feel colder than it should. What unsettled me most, though, was the piano in the parlor. It was a massive, antique upright with ornate carvings on its surface. My grandmother used to play it when she was alive, but after she passed, no one touched it. Yet, whenever I visited, I swore I could hear faint notes coming from the parlor, even though the lid was always closed. The first night we stayed in the house, I had trouble sleeping. My room was on the second floor, and the mattress felt lumpy, the air too cold despite the heater running full blast. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a soft, melodic sound, a single piano key being pressed. I froze, my heart racing. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But then it came again, this time a short sequence of notes, like someone was trying to remember an old tune. Gathering all my courage, I tiptoed down the stairs and peeked into the parlor. The room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The piano sat in its usual spot, silent and still. I stood there for a moment, my ears straining for any sound, but the house was quiet. Shaking my head, I went back to bed, determined to blame it on my imagination. The next day, I mentioned the noises to my mom. She laughed it off. "It's an old house," she said. "Probably just the wind rattling something." But I noticed she didn't meet my eyes when she said it. That evening, as we sorted through boxes in the attic, I found an old photo album. Flipping through its yellowed pages, I came across a picture of my grandmother sitting at the piano. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, and there was a man standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. I didn't recognize him. "Mom, who's this?" I asked, showing her the photo. Her face went pale. That's Peter," she said hesitantly. "Your grandmother's first husband. He died before I was born." She never talked about him. That night, the piano played again. This time, it wasn't just a few scattered notes. It was a melody, soft and haunting. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, too terrified to move. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the house in an eerie silence. The next morning, I decided to inspect the piano more closely. In the daylight, it looked harmless, though the carved faces on its surface seemed almost lifelike. I hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside, the keys were yellowed with age, and the strings were covered in a fine layer of dust. There was no way it could have played on its own. "Did you hear it last night?" I asked my mom over breakfast. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "Your grandmother used to say Peter's spirit lingered in the house. She believed he communicated through the piano. It's silly, I know, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she didn't finish her sentence. That evening, as we were packing up the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly. The air felt heavy, and I noticed my breath fogging up. Then, the piano lid slammed shut with a deafening bang. My mom and I both jumped, staring at the instrument in stunned silence. "It's just the house," she whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Over the next few days, the activity grew more intense. Objects would move on their own. A picture frame falling off the mantel, a vase sliding across the table. The piano played every night now, its mournful melody echoing through the house. My mom finally admitted she'd been hearing it too. The last night we stayed there was the worst. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth. Summoning my courage, I opened the door to find the hallway empty. But the footsteps continued, now coming from downstairs. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding. The parlor door was ajar, and faint light spilled out into the hallway. As I approached, the piano's melody grew louder. Peeking inside, I saw the keys moving on their own, the lid lifting and closing as if invisible hands were playing it. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The music stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and spun around. But no one was there. That was enough for me. I ran upstairs, grabbed my mom and our bags, and insisted we leave immediately. She didn't argue. We never went back to the house. My uncle handled the sale, and as far as I know, the new owners haven't experienced anything unusual. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that melody in my dreams, the soft, haunting notes of a piano that shouldn't be playing. And when I wake up, I'm always afraid I'll find myself back in that parlor, staring at the piano and the secrets it refused to keep. When my family moved into the old house on Elm Street, I knew something wasn't right. The house had been vacant for years, and its history was the kind people only spoke about in hushed tones. "That's the clockmaker's house," the neighbors would say, their faces shadowed with unease. Apparently, the previous owner, an eccentric old man named Mr. Garvey, had been a recluse who spent his days tinkering with clocks. When he passed, the house sat empty, slowly decaying as time moved on. My parents were thrilled to get the property for such a low price, but I couldn't share their enthusiasm. From the moment we moved in, the house felt alive. It wasn't just the way the walls seemed to groan or how the floors creaked underfoot. It was the sounds, soft, rhythmic ticking noises that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The first night, I couldn't sleep. My room was at the top of the stairs, and the air felt colder there, even with the heater on. As I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard it, a faint tick-tick-tick, like the sound of a clock. I got up to investigate, expecting to find an old clock left behind by Mr. Garvey. But when I followed the noise, it seemed to move. One moment it was coming from the hallway, the next from the living room. Eventually, it led me to the basement door. The basement was dark and musty, the kind of place where you'd expect to find cobwebs and mice. But the ticking was louder now, drawing me down the creaky wooden steps. My flashlight beam bounced off the damp stone walls as I searched for the source. In the corner, I found an old grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight. The ticking seemed to be coming from it, even though it wasn't running. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they brushed it off. "It's probably just the house settling," Dad said. Like that explained anything. Mom, on the other hand, looked uneasy but didn't say much. I decided to leave it alone. Maybe I was just imagining things. But the noises didn't stop. Over the next few days, the ticking grew louder and more frequent. Sometimes it sounded like multiple clocks ticking at once, their rhythms overlapping in an almost musical way. Other times, I'd hear faint whispers between the ticks, though I could never make out the words. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs. The grandfather clock from the basement was now in the middle of the living room, its hands still frozen at midnight. My parents insisted I must have moved it as a prank, but I swore I hadn't touched it. Dad moved it back to the basement, muttering about how kids these days had too much imagination. That night, I dreamed of Mr. Garvey. In the dream, he was sitting at a workbench surrounded by hundreds of clocks, their hands spinning wildly. He looked up at me and smiled, but his eyes were cold, lifeless. "Time waits for no one," he said, his voice echoing as the dream dissolved into darkness. When I woke up, I felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the basement. I found the grandfather clock in its usual spot, but something was different. The glass face was cracked, and inside, the pendulum was swinging, though the clock still wasn't running. As I stood there, the ticking grew louder, more frantic, like a heartbeat racing out of control. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. That's when I noticed the door. Hidden behind a stack of old boxes was a small wooden door, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. I'd never seen it before, and something about it filled me with dread. I reached out to open it, but before I could, the lights flickered, and the basement plunged into darkness. I ran upstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The next day, I convinced my mom to come down to the basement with me. But when we got there, the door was gone. The boxes were still there, stacked neatly against the wall, but the door had vanished as if it had never existed. Mom gave me a worried look and suggested I get more sleep. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said. "This move hasn't been easy on any of us." I tried to take her advice, but sleep was impossible. Every night, the ticking grew louder, and the whispers more insistent. Sometimes I'd wake up to find objects in my room move, as if someone had been searching through my things. One morning, I found an old pocket watch on my desk. It was ornate, with intricate carvings on the case, but when I opened it, the hands were spinning backward. The final straw came a week later. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me home alone. As I sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, the ticking started again. This time, it was deafening, echoing through the house like a drumbeat. Then the whispers started, louder than ever, and I could finally make out the words. "Time is running out." I ran upstairs, grabbing my phone to call my parents, but the line was dead. That's when I heard the basement door creak open. I knew I should have run out of the house, but something compelled me to go down those stairs one last time. The door I'd seen before was back, only now it was wide open. Beyond it was a small, dimly lit room filled with clocks of all shapes and sizes. They were all ticking in perfect unison, their hands spinning wildly. In the center of the room stood Mr. Garvey. He looked just as he had in my dream, only now his face was twisted into a sinister grin. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice layered with echoes. "Time doesn't belong to you anymore." The lights flickered, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up on the living room floor. My parents found me there, pale and shaking, unable to explain what had happened. We moved out of the house the next day, leaving everything behind. I don't know who bought the clockmaker's house, or if they've experienced the same things I did. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that familiar ticking sound, soft and steady, as if time itself is trying to remind me that it's always watching. The house at the end of Sycamore Lane was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, with its gabled roof, bay windows, and wraparound porch. My parents bought it as a fixer-upper, lured by its charm and the bargain price. I wasn't so easily convinced. The house had a reputation in town, though no one could agree on the details. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was haunted. All I knew was that from the moment we stepped inside, it felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't mold or rot. It was something faint, like burning candles mixed with old wood. The air seemed heavier inside, pressing against my chest. My parents dismissed my unease, calling it atmosphere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house didn't want us there. One of the most striking features of the house was the long hallway on the second floor. The walls were lined with old portraits, their subjects staring out with expressions that seemed just a little too lifelike. The previous owners had left them behind, and my mom insisted we keep them as part of the house's history. I hated them. No matter where you stood, their eyes seemed to follow you. The first night we stayed in the house, I woke to a soft tapping sound. It was faint at first, like someone gently knocking on a door, but it grew louder and more insistent. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the hallway. Clutching my flashlight, I crept to my door and cracked it open. The hallway was dark, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. The tapping continued, now coming from farther down the hall. As I stepped out, the sound stopped. I scanned the portraits, my flashlight beam bouncing off their glossy surfaces. Everything was still. Then I saw it. One of the portraits, a man in a dark suit with piercing eyes, was hanging crooked on the wall. It hadn't been like that earlier. My heart raced as I straightened it, the frame cold under my fingers. I hurried back to my room and locked the door, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, I told my parents about the noise. "Old houses make sounds," my dad said dismissively. "It's probably the wind," but the noises didn't stop. Over the next few days, I heard tapping, faint whispers, and even what sounded like footsteps in the hallway. The portraits became more unsettling, too. I could have sworn their expressions changed slightly each time I looked at them. A smirk here, a furrowed brow there. One night, I noticed a faint smudge on the glass of one of the frames. When I wiped it away, I realized it was on the inside. Things escalated when my little sister, Lily, started talking about her friend. She was only 6 and had always had a vivid imagination, so at first, we didn't think much of it. But the way she described her friend sent chills down my spine. "She lives in the walls," Lily said matter-of-factly over breakfast one morning. "She's nice. She likes to sing." My mom exchanged a nervous glance with my dad. "What does she look like?" Mom asked. Lily shrugged. "She's small, and her dress is dirty." That night, I woke up to the sound of humming. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting through the walls. My skin prickled as I lay there, too scared to move. The humming stopped suddenly, and the house fell silent. Then, the tapping began again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from inside my room. I bolted upright, my eyes darting around the dark room. The tapping grew louder, and then I saw it. One of the portraits from the hallway was now leaning against my desk. It was the man in the dark suit, his piercing eyes staring straight at me. My scream brought my parents running. They tried to calm me down, but when I showed them the portrait, their faces went pale. "How did this get in here?" my dad muttered, more to himself than to me. He took the portrait back to the hallway, but I refused to sleep in my room that night. The next day, my mom decided we should take the portraits down and store them in the attic. As we removed them, I noticed something strange. Behind each frame was a name and a date scratched into the wall. Some of the dates went back over a century. One name stood out, Margaret, 1892. It matched the description of Lily's friend. That evening, as we carried the portraits up to the attic, the house seemed to grow colder. The air felt charged, like right before a storm. When we reached the attic, we found an old trunk in the corner. Inside were more portraits, smaller and older. Their faces faded but still eerily detailed. My mom decided we'd deal with them later and locked the attic door behind us. That night, the noises were worse than ever. The tapping was constant, joined by the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. The humming returned, louder and more discordant. At one point, I thought I heard someone whisper my name. The final straw came when Lily went missing. We searched the entire house, calling her name, but there was no answer. Then we heard her giggling, faint and distant, coming from the attic. My dad broke the lock and threw the door open. There, in the center of the attic, was Lily, sitting cross-legged in front of the trunk. The portraits we'd stored there were scattered around her, and she was humming softly. "Lily, what are you doing?" My mom cried, pulling her away. "She wanted me to play with her," Lily said, pointing at one of the portraits. It was Margaret, her face now twisted into a grotesque grin. We left the house the next day, leaving the portraits and everything else behind. My parents never talked about what happened, and we moved to a small apartment across town. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint tapping sounds, like someone knocking on a door that should never be opened. I've never believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just stories, things made up to scare little kids. But that all changed one night, when I encountered something far worse than a ghost, a doppelganger. It started out like any normal day. I was hanging out with my friends, scrolling through my phone, and talking about the usual stuff: school, parties, and life in general. I'd been feeling kind of off lately, though, like something was just wrong. Maybe it was the stress from the upcoming final exams, or the pressure to keep up with everything. But looking back, I think it was something else. It was a Tuesday night when it happened. I was home alone, a rare occurrence since my parents usually got home before dinner. I had just finished my homework and was getting ready for bed. It was about 10 p.m., and the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, which always made me feel a little uneasy. I went to my bedroom, dimming the lights and pulling the curtains open to let in some moonlight. I liked to have a bit of light when I slept. Somehow, the dark seemed too overwhelming without it. Everything seemed fine at first. I crawled into bed and pulled the blankets over me. As I was about to close my eyes, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, too regular to be random. I slowly got up from my bed and walked over to the window. I couldn't see anything outside, just the dim glow of the streetlights from down the road. The tapping continued. It was coming from the outside of the window, but there was no one there. My heart began to race. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling a little. There was no answer, just the continued tapping. My breath caught in my throat as the realization slowly dawned on me. The tapping was coming from inside the house. I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I left the window unlocked? Could someone be inside? But it didn't make sense. The sound was soft, like a fingernail gently tapping against glass. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. For a long moment, I stood frozen, my hand resting on the windowsill. The house was silent again, except for the occasional hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Then, I heard it: footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging footsteps coming from the hallway just outside my door. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move, my breath held in my chest. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard something else breathing. Shallow, uneven, like someone struggling to stay quiet. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely a sound, but no one answered. My parents weren't supposed to be home yet. I mustered up the courage to open the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the doorknob. I cracked the door just wide enough to peer through. Standing at the end of the hallway was me. It was my reflection, my exact face, my body, my posture, but there was something wrong. Its eyes weren't mine. They were cold and empty, as if they were staring right through me. I couldn't move. The figure in the hallway didn't move either. It just stood there, silently staring at me. I wanted to scream, but the fear had paralyzed me. It raised one hand, slowly, like it was testing the air, and then it took a step toward me. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and dialed my mom's number. It rang 3 times before she picked up. "Hello," she answered, her voice groggy. "Mom, something's wrong. There's someone in the house," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "What? Where are you?" she asked, her tone suddenly alert. I don't know, but it looks like me. There's someone standing outside my door, and it looks exactly like me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean, exactly like you? She finally asked, her voice serious now. Like, it's me, but it's not me. It's wrong, I said, panic starting to take over. I need you to come home now. I'm on my way, she said quickly. Stay locked in your room. Don't open the door for anyone. I stayed on the phone with her, my ear pressed against the door, listening for any signs of movement. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting, heart thumping in my chest. The only sound was my breath and the occasional scrape of something against the door. Then, the window rattled. I jumped, turning my head toward it. There was no tapping now, but the window. It was shaking, as if something was outside, trying to get in. I knew I had locked it earlier. I was sure of it. I grabbed my phone again, but before I could do anything, I heard the voice. It was my voice. Let me in, it whispered, barely audible through the door. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. What do you want? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, just that same shallow breathing. The voice spoke again. Let me in. I'm you. It sounded so much like me, but it wasn't me. I knew it wasn't. I backed away from the door slowly, my phone still in my hand, but I wasn't sure what to do next. Then I heard the sound I never expected. My mom's voice calling out from downstairs. My name. Are you okay? Open the door, she shouted, but I knew it wasn't her. It wasn't. It couldn't be. The voice was wrong. I gripped the phone tighter. Mom, stay away. I shouted back. Don't come up here. The voice downstairs didn't answer, but I heard the footsteps moving. I waited until the steps faded and everything was silent again. The worst part? My parents didn't come home for another 2 hours. When they finally did, they found me huddled in my room, crying and terrified. They searched the entire house, but there was no sign of anyone else. No sign of me. My mom didn't believe me. She thought it was just stress, or my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And to this day, I still don't understand what it was. But I know one thing for sure. There are things out there, things that look like us, but they're not us. And they have sinister plans. Now, I never sleep with the curtains open, and I never, ever look out the window after dark. Because I know that thing is still out there, watching, waiting, pretending to be me. I was always the kind of person who believed in logic. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. Everything had an explanation, and I prided myself on my ability to make sense of the world. But one night, just one night, completely shattered that belief. I still can't explain what happened, and I'm not sure I want to. It all started when I moved into my first apartment. I had just turned 18, and it was a big deal to me. The place was small but cozy, just big enough for me to stretch out and start building my independence. I didn't mind being alone. I actually liked it. It gave me the peace I needed to focus on school and my hobbies. The apartment was old. It had that musty smell to it that comes with buildings that have been standing for decades. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked whenever I walked around. But it was mine. In the corner of the living room, there was an antique mirror that I hadn't paid much attention to. It was framed in dark wood, with carvings around the edges that looked like they belonged in a museum. It had been left there by the previous tenant, who had apparently moved out in a hurry. I didn't think much of it at first, other than the fact that it was kind of beautiful. One evening, a few weeks after I moved in, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. The mirror. It wasn't just reflecting the living room, like it should have. Instead, it seemed to show a different version of the room, darker, as if the lighting was dimmed. I figured I was just tired or imagining things, but as I glanced at it again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I decided to shrug it off and keep reading, but that night, as I went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the thought kept creeping into my mind. What if the mirror wasn't just reflecting the room? What if it was showing something else? The next morning, I decided to test it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. At first, it was just the usual. My messy hair, my tired eyes, and the casual clothes I'd thrown on. But then, as I kept looking, something strange happened. My reflection moved a little slower than I did. At first, I thought I was imagining it again. But when I waved my hand, my reflection hesitated before it did the same. It was subtle, but I could see it. I felt my heart skip a beat. I turned away from the mirror, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "It's nothing," I told myself. "You're just tired." But deep down, I knew something was off. The next few days were normal, but the mirror kept bothering me. Every time I walked past it, I felt that strange unease. I tried to ignore it, but it was like the mirror was calling to me, always pulling my attention. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something in the apartment. It was a quiet, faint noise, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. I sat up, trying to make out what it was. At first, I couldn't hear it clearly, but then I realized it was coming from the living room. I stood up and walked quietly to the door of my bedroom. The apartment was dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the window. I felt my way down the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. As I passed the living room, I froze. There was someone standing in front of the mirror. At first, I thought it was just me, a trick of the light, but then I saw my reflection. It wasn't me. It was someone else. The figure in the mirror was a man, tall with dark hair, wearing a hoodie. His face was twisted, a sinister smirk curling at the edges of his lips, and he was staring directly at me. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The man in the reflection tilted his head, his smile widening, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't know what to do. My legs were frozen in place. The man in the mirror was still staring at me, his eyes dark and hollow, like they held some terrible secret. And then, he moved. He raised his hand slowly, almost as if he was reaching out to me. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the mirror had some kind of hold on me. The figure reached out further, until his hand was inches from the glass. And then, I saw it. Behind him, in the reflection, stood me. But it wasn't the me I knew. It was me, but with hollow eyes, a twisted smile on my face, and a cold, lifeless expression. I couldn't breathe. My reflection in the mirror was alive. I turned and ran to the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I locked myself in my bedroom and called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes, but by the time they searched the apartment, there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, and definitely no strange man in the mirror. The mirror was exactly as it had been before, just an ordinary mirror reflecting an empty room. The police thought I was just having a nightmare, or that I'd imagined it, but I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. For the next few days, I couldn't bring myself to even look at the mirror. I stayed away from the living room entirely, and I kept the curtains drawn at all times. But then, one evening, I made the mistake of walking past the mirror again. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was just curious, or maybe I thought it couldn't hurt to look. But when I passed by, I saw it again. The figure in the mirror. It was me this time, just like before, but something was different. My reflection was moving on its own, out of sync with me. As I walked, my reflection stayed behind, watching me, its cold smile growing wider with each step. It felt like it was mocking me, like it knew I was too terrified to do anything about it. I backed away from the mirror, my hands shaking. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't stop myself from staring at the reflection. I don't know how much time passed before I snapped out of it, but when I finally looked away, my reflection was gone. It was just an ordinary mirror again. After that night, things got worse. The figure in the mirror kept appearing. Every time I looked into it, my reflection would be slightly different, slightly off. My smile would be too wide, my eyes too dark, like I wasn't the one staring back. And sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone in my apartment. When I'd check, I'd always find the mirror reflecting something else. A shadow in the corner, an empty room, or sometimes just a twisted version of myself staring back at me. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know why it started. But after weeks of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave the apartment. I packed up everything, even though I couldn't explain what had been happening. I just knew I couldn't stay there. But I wasn't free. When I left, I thought I'd left it all behind. But now, every time I pass a mirror, I can't help but glance at it. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of him. That dark figure, that twisted version of myself. It's like he's still watching me, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. But I do know this: the mirror never lies. And sometimes, what it reflects isn't just a picture of the world. It's a glimpse into something darker, something that doesn't belong, something with sinister intentions. And it's always waiting to come back. I always believed that the scariest things were just the things we couldn't explain. The noises in the dark, the shadows that moved in the corner of your eye, the feeling that someone was watching you even when no one was around. But that all changed one winter night when I found out that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that look exactly like you. It was the middle of January, and the snow had been falling for days. The kind of snow that makes everything feel quiet, almost suffocating. The world outside was blanketed in white, and our small town was practically deserted, with everyone staying indoors. I was home alone. My parents had gone to visit my grandmother for the weekend, and I had decided to stay behind to catch up on homework and relax for once. The house was big, too big for just me, especially since my older brother had moved out a year ago. It had always felt a little eerie, but I was used to it. My room was in the attic, the farthest corner of the house. From my window, I could see the whole backyard and the tree line in the distance. At night, it was peaceful, too peaceful sometimes. It was almost as if the silence was oppressive. That night, around 9 p.m., I was sitting in my room, wrapped in a blanket and scrolling through my phone. It had been a long day, and I was about to head to bed when I heard it. The sound came from the basement. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make strange noises, right? But then I heard it again. A thud. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I frowned, trying to ignore it, but then the noise came again, louder this time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was an animal that had somehow gotten inside, or the wind. Maybe shifting something in the basement, but something about it felt wrong. The noise was too distinct, too rhythmic. I grabbed my phone, intending to call my parents, but then I realized they wouldn't pick up. They were probably too far out of town to hear it, and I didn't want to bother them with something that could be nothing. Instead, I slowly crept down the stairs to investigate. As I descended into the hallway, I could hear the noise more clearly now. It was coming from the basement, the room that always gave me the creeps. My parents used it for storage, but I had never liked going down there. It was dark, musty, and always seemed colder than the rest of the house. I stood at the door to the basement, my heart thudding in my chest. The door was cracked open, just enough to let a sliver of light from the hallway spill into the dark abyss below. I had to force myself to breathe. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and then, before I could think any longer, I turned it. The door creaked as it opened, and the sound of dragging stopped abruptly. The basement was completely dark, the only light coming from the small window at the top of the stairs, casting long shadows across the floor. I took a cautious step inside, the air immediately feeling colder. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my feet as I made my way down. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and I could see the rows of old furniture, boxes, and piles of random things that my parents had stored there over the years. Then, I saw him, standing near the far corner of the basement. Just outside the reach of the dim light was a figure. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. For a split second, I thought it was my father, maybe coming home early. But then I remembered that he wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. I froze. "Dad," I called out, my voice trembling in the cold air. The figure didn't move, didn't answer. The silence hung thick, and I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. I took a step forward, trying to see his face more clearly, but he remained in the shadows, unmoving. "Dad, is that you?" I asked again, this time a little louder. There was no response, but I noticed something. His posture was wrong. It wasn't the relaxed stance of someone just standing there, waiting. His shoulders were tense, and his head was slightly tilted, as if he were studying me. He wasn't responding, but I could feel his gaze on me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and took another step closer. Suddenly, he moved. He turned around, fast, too fast, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure's face was now visible, and I immediately regretted taking that step. It wasn't my father. The man standing before me looked almost exactly like me. Same height, same build, same features, except his eyes. His eyes were dark, empty, cold, and his smile, it wasn't the smile I recognized. It was twisted, mocking, like he was enjoying my fear. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. "Who are you?" I whispered, but my voice was barely audible. The man took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. And then, with a voice that wasn't mine but sounded eerily familiar, he spoke. "I'm you." My blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. How could he be me? How could anyone be me? I could feel the panic building inside me, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to think. The man in the basement didn't move any closer. Instead, he just stood there, watching me with those cold, dead eyes. I couldn't look away, like there was some kind of pull, some force that made me stay rooted to the spot. Then, something changed. His face contorted, and the twisted smile returned. "I'm everything you fear," he said in a low, mocking tone. "I'm the one you don't want to become, the person you'll never escape." I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't stop to look back. My feet pounded against the stairs as I rushed up, my mind a blur of terror. I reached the top, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. I stood there in the hallway, panting for breath, my hands trembling. The house felt suddenly too quiet, too still. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the whole thing, if it was some sort of nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still down there, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed in my room, unable to shake the image of that man, the thing that looked like me, but wasn't. I told myself it was just a bad dream, that I was overreacting. But when my parents came home the next day, everything seemed normal. Except one thing. The basement door was open, and there were fresh footprints leading into the basement. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. Maybe it was some sort of twisted prank. Or maybe it was something darker, something that's been following me since then. Now, every time I'm home alone, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. I know that whatever it was that I saw in the basement, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear I see him again. That man, with my face, staring back at me, waiting. I've always considered myself a level-headed person. I'm not easily frightened by silly things like horror movies or ghost stories. But what happened to me wasn't something I could explain away. It was real, and it still haunts me. I'll never forget the night I met my doppelganger. It all started on a typical Friday evening. I had just turned 16 a few months ago, and everything was going well. I had a steady group of friends, I was doing fine in school, and for the most part, life was pretty normal. It wasn't like I expected anything extraordinary to happen on this night. Just the usual weekend routine. I stayed at home, playing video games and watching TV while my parents went out for the evening. The house was quiet. I had the whole place to myself, and I wasn't complaining. My parents would be gone for a few hours, so I had plenty of time to myself. I was sitting on the couch, eyes glued to the screen, when I heard a knock on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor was looking for my parents. So, I stood up, walked over to the door, and peeked through the peephole. The figure standing on the other side was unfamiliar, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't place it at first. She was a girl, maybe my age, but she wasn't wearing a coat or any outerwear, even though it was cold outside. She had long brown hair that looked almost exactly like mine, and her eyes were just a little too wide. Her smile didn't seem genuine, either. It was too forced, like she was trying to convince me to open the door. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something about this felt off, and my instincts told me not to open the door. But then, she spoke. "Hey, I'm looking for my friend Rachel. Is she home?" Her voice was high-pitched and sweet, but there was something unsettling about it. I paused, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't know anyone named Rachel, at least not well enough for someone to be knocking on my door asking about her. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. "I think you have the wrong house," I finally said, my voice shaky. "I don't know anyone named Rachel." The girl blinked, her expression faltering for just a second. But then she smiled again, that same creepy, forced grin. "Oh, that's okay. I was just looking for her. No big deal. See you later then." Before I could respond, she turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the darkness of the evening. I stood there, staring at the spot where she had been, my mind whirling. It didn't make sense. Why would someone come to my house and ask for someone who didn't live here? I decided to shake it off. Maybe she had just been confused, or maybe she had been in a hurry, but I couldn't quite get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, after my parents had come home, I told them about the girl at the door. They didn't seem too concerned, brushing it off as a mistake, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, something strange happened. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I saw a post from my best friend, Emma. She had uploaded a picture of her and another girl. The girl looked familiar. I had to do a double take. It was her, the girl who had knocked on my door the night before. I couldn't believe it. How was it possible that she knew Emma? I thought I was just seeing things, but the longer I stared at the photo, the more my stomach churned. It was the same girl. Same hair, same eyes, same smile. The only difference was that in the photo, she looked happy. Her smile seemed genuine, unlike the creepy one she had given me. I quickly messaged Emma. "Hey, who's the girl in that picture you posted?" "I think I met her last night." Emma responded almost immediately. "Oh, that's my cousin Rachel. You met her last night, right? She came by to say hi to you." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. Rachel? That wasn't possible. The girl at my door hadn't been Rachel. She couldn't have been. I didn't know her, and I had never seen her before. I certainly hadn't invited her over. I tried to brush it off again. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had misremembered her face, or maybe I had seen someone who looked like her. But as the night went on, I began to feel a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, things started to get stranger. It wasn't just the girl at the door. It was the little things. I'd catch glimpses of someone who looked exactly like me, but not quite. One evening, I was sitting in the kitchen, making a snack, when I glanced in the reflection of the microwave. I could have sworn I saw my own face, but not quite. The girl looking back at me had a slight smile on her lips, and her eyes were colder than mine. But it wasn't just that. It was the way she stood, the way her head tilted. It wasn't me. It was someone else. Someone who looked like me but wasn't. I turned quickly, but the kitchen was empty. The reflection disappeared, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Things escalated even further. My parents, oblivious to my growing paranoia, continued with their daily routines. But one evening, as I was leaving my room, I heard a soft knock on the front door. I froze. It was the same pattern, the same feeling of unease. I approached the door cautiously, and as I peeked through the peephole, I saw her again. It was Rachel. No mistake this time. She was standing there on the porch, just like the first time. Her dark hair hung loosely around her shoulders, her eyes wide and expectant, and that same forced, unnatural smile on her face. This time, though, something was different. She wasn't smiling at all. Instead, her expression was flat, almost vacant. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't going to open it. I couldn't. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of footsteps fading away. I waited a few more moments before I gathered the courage to open the door. But there was no one there. I stepped outside, my hands trembling, The porch was empty, the wind howling through the trees, but there was no sign of her. No sign of Rachel or anyone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The girl at the door, the reflections, the strange sense of being watched. It was all starting to get to me. The next day, I went to Emma's house to confront her. I needed answers. I needed to know if this Rachel girl was somehow involved in all of this. Emma answered the door with a bright smile. "Hey, what's up?" I quickly asked her about Rachel, and she looked confused. "Rachel? She hasn't been around lately. She hasn't even visited in a few weeks. Are you sure it was her?" I felt my stomach drop. "I saw her last night. She was standing on my front porch." Emma looked even more confused now. "Rachel's been gone for weeks, though. She told me she was leaving town for a while." I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. The girl I'd seen wasn't Rachel. She looked exactly like me, and she wasn't just watching me. She was trying to be me. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and confusion. I kept seeing things that couldn't be explained. Reflections of myself that weren't mine, footsteps behind me when no one was there, whispers in the wind. And I knew it wasn't over, because the next time I looked in the mirror, the girl who wasn't me was smiling back. And it wasn't a nice smile. I've always been a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. My life was grounded in logic and reason. That all changed one summer night, and I still can't explain what happened. Something that involved a doppelganger, a figure that looked just like me but wasn't. It was as if reality itself bent and twisted around me, pulling me into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It all started when I was staying with my aunt in a small town just outside of the city. My parents had decided to take a week-long vacation, and instead of staying home alone, they thought it'd be better for me to spend some time with Aunt Grace. She lived in an old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. A house that always seemed a little too quiet, a little too still. I'd visited before, but this time something felt off. When I arrived, Aunt Grace was happy to see me. She was a sweet woman, always kind and welcoming, but there was a strange air about her house. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The house was beautiful in its own way, filled with old furniture and pictures of family I didn't recognize. It felt lived in, but not in the warm, homey sense. It was as if the house had a secret, something it wasn't telling anyone. The first day went smoothly. Aunt Grace made me my favorite dinner, spaghetti, and we watched movies together. It was relaxing, like a summer vacation should be. But things began to change the following evening, and that's when I first noticed her. I was upstairs in the guest room, reading a book by the window, when I saw a figure standing in the front yard. It was late, the sun had just set, and the yard was barely visible in the low light. But I could make out the outline of a person standing by the fence, staring at the house. I thought it was probably just a neighbor or someone walking by, but something about the stillness of the figure caught my attention. It stood unnaturally still, unmoving. Curious, I stood up and walked to the window to get a better look. When I did, the figure turned toward the house, and for a brief moment, I could see its face. My heart stopped. The figure was a girl, around my age, with long brown hair and a pale face. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There was something about her expression that didn't seem right. Her eyes were too wide, too intense. It was like she was staring directly into my soul. I quickly pulled back from the window, my pulse racing. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something wrong. But I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was someone walking their dog. But that night, when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept wandering back to the girl in the yard, her cold eyes, and the way she stood so still. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't the peaceful sleep I was hoping for. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound coming from the hallway outside my room. It was faint, but it was there. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking through the house. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt tight, my mouth dry. I was frozen, terrified. The footsteps didn't move for what felt like hours. Then, finally, I heard the sound of a door creaking open and someone walking away, their steps growing fainter with each passing second. I didn't dare leave my room to investigate. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, praying that it was just a dream. But the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the footsteps or the girl in the yard. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the pit of my stomach. Aunt Grace didn't seem to notice anything strange. She was in her usual cheerful mood when I came downstairs for breakfast, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen and heard. Later that day, as I was helping Aunt Grace clean the house, I found something odd. It was an old photograph, tucked behind a stack of books on a shelf. The picture was black and white, faded with age. It was a family portrait. Aunt Grace was in it, but there was someone else standing beside her. A girl who looked just like me. She had the same hair, the same features, the same smile. I froze, holding the photo in my hands. The girl in the picture looked almost exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. She could have been my twin, but I had never seen her before. I quickly looked up at Aunt Grace, who was dusting off a nearby table. "Aunt Grace, who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. She turned and smiled at me, but there was something odd about her smile, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, that's my sister," she said softly. "She passed away a long time ago." I stared at the photo, my mind racing. She looks like me. Aunt Grace's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "It's just a coincidence," she said, her voice a little too calm. "Don't worry about it." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The girl in the photo, the one who looked like me, was somehow connected to everything that had been happening. The figure in the yard, the footsteps, the strange feeling that something wasn't right. It all felt tied to her. That night, the events took a more sinister turn. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a soft knock at my door. At first, I thought it was Aunt Grace checking on me, but when I called out, there was no response. I hesitated, my heart racing. The knock came again, this time louder. I slowly got out of bed and opened the door. No one was there. I stood in the hallway, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I turned back to my room, and that's when I saw her. The girl from the yard, standing in the doorway of my room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward, her feet silent on the wooden floor. I could feel her presence, cold, like an ice-cold wind had filled the room. I turned to run, but she was faster. She grabbed my wrist, her grip cold and tight, and pulled me toward her. I screamed, but no sound came out. Her hand tightened, her eyes never leaving mine. I tried to struggle, but it felt like my body was paralyzed, as if I was no longer in control. Then, everything stopped. I blinked, and suddenly, I was back in bed, the room quiet and still. The girl was gone. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, and looked around. There was no sign of anyone. I was alone in my room, just like before. But the memory of what had just happened lingered in my mind. Was it a dream? Had I imagined it all? I couldn't be sure. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Something had shifted. The girl wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was real, and she was connected to me in a way I didn't understand. The next morning, I woke up to find a new photo on the kitchen counter. It was a picture of me, my face, my eyes, but there was something off about it. The person in the picture was smiling, but it wasn't my smile. It was twisted, wrong, and in the background, standing in the shadows, was the girl from the yard. Her eyes were watching me again. I felt the chill creep up my spine, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just some coincidence. The girl, whoever she was trying to take my place. The house, my life. Everything had become a twisted version of reality. I didn't know how to escape or how to fight back. All I knew was that I couldn't trust anything anymore, especially not the person who looked exactly like me. because she wasn't me, and she wasn't going to stop until she took everything I had. I've always been the type of person who doesn't get scared easily. I love horror movies, haunted houses, anything that gives me a good thrill. But what happened to me a few weeks ago changed all that. It wasn't a movie or a haunted house. It was something much more terrifying, something that felt all too real. It started when I moved to a new town with my family. We had been living in a small apartment in the city for years, and my parents thought it would be good for us to have more space. So, they decided to buy an old house in a quiet town a few hours away. At first, I was excited. New house, new people, new life. I thought it would be the perfect fresh start. The house itself was beautiful, an old Victorian-style home with tall windows and an overgrown garden. It had a charm to it, but also a sense of age. There was a history there. I could feel it. My parents loved it. They were so eager to move in, to start our new chapter. But the moment I stepped through the door, something didn't sit right with me. It was just a feeling, but it was enough to make me uneasy. The house wasn't in the best shape. There were creaky floorboards, peeling paint, and rooms that smelled a little musty. But despite all of that, it was home now. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. It wasn't until I started unpacking my things that I noticed the first strange occurrence. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. It was small, but cozy, with a large mirror on the wall across from the bed. The mirror had a dark wooden frame, old but beautifully carved. I remember thinking it looked out of place, like it had been there for 100 years. At night, after I'd settled in, I noticed something odd. Whenever I looked into the mirror, I felt as though I wasn't alone. It wasn't a physical sensation, but more like an emotional one. There was something in the reflection that didn't quite match up. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it kept happening. Each time I glanced into the mirror, I could see a shadow, a figure standing behind me. I would turn quickly, but there was never anyone there. It was always just my reflection staring back at me, like nothing had changed. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just getting used to the new house. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. One night, as I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I looked into the mirror above the sink and froze. My reflection was off. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was enough to make my heart race. The person in the mirror was smiling. A wide, sinister grin stretched across my face, but it wasn't my smile. It was something wrong. The smile was too wide, too forced. My eyes were dull and lifeless. I dropped the toothbrush and stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. When I blinked and looked again, the reflection was back to normal, but I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that I wasn't alone in my room. I would hear strange noises, like footsteps in the hallway or something scraping against the walls. I told myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went downstairs for breakfast. My mom and dad were already sitting at the table, chatting about their plans for the day. I didn't want to worry them, so I kept the experience to myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. I would catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, like a shadow moving just out of view. Sometimes, when I passed by the mirror, I would see the reflection of someone who wasn't me, someone who looked like me but wasn't quite right. They had the same features, the same hair, but there was something unsettling about the way they looked. Their eyes were too bright, too intense. It was like they were staring directly at me, waiting for something. It wasn't just the mirror, though. The more I looked into it, the more I started noticing changes in my reflection. Sometimes, I would see my reflection move before I did. It would tilt its head slightly, or its expression would shift in a way that I hadn't done. I would freeze, watching, trying to understand what was happening. But as soon as I moved, the reflection would follow. It was like I was being mimicked, like the mirror was trying to copy me. The worst part was when I started seeing the figure in the mirror even when I wasn't looking. I would wake up in the middle of the night, and there it was, standing behind me, staring out of the mirror with that same cold, empty gaze. Sometimes, I would hear it whisper my name, a low, raspy voice that didn't sound like mine. But when I turned around, there would be nothing there. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The reflection was normal, just me, standing there, looking back at myself. But then, the reflection grinned. It wasn't my grin. It was the same twisted, unnatural smile I had seen before. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. But then, something even worse happened. The reflection didn't stop grinning. It leaned forward, its face pressed close to the glass. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and I could see something moving behind it, like shadows shifting. My reflection was changing. The person in the mirror was becoming something else. It started to look more distorted, its features warping and melting, like it was trying to escape the glass. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was trapped in that room with it. And then, it spoke. "Leave," it whispered. Its voice not my own. It was cold, low, and full of malice. "Leave before I take you." I stumbled backward, tripping over my feet and falling to the floor. The mirror was still there, reflecting nothing but the empty room. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the room, my mind spinning. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. My reflection had spoken to me. It had warned me. And yet, it had been my own voice in the reflection, but not mine at the same time. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. Every time I passed by the mirror, I felt it watching me. Sometimes, I would catch it moving, as if it was reaching out, trying to grab me. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. I started avoiding the mirror altogether. I covered it with a sheet, hoping that it would stop, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would leave me alone. But it didn't. It only got worse. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the sound of glass shattering. It came from downstairs, from the living room. My heart jumped in my chest, and I rushed out of bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I crept down the stairs, my feet making no noise on the old wood floors. When I reached the living room, I froze. The mirror was shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just the mirror that was broken. The reflection was no longer in the shards. There was a figure standing in the center of the room, facing me. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. The same face, the same hair. But the eyes, those eyes, were empty. Black holes. It was like staring into the abyss. And that twisted smile was still there. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to take my eyes off the figure. It stepped forward, its feet silent on the broken glass. The smile stretched wider, and it whispered again, "You should have left when you had the chance." And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The living room was empty again. The only sound was the beating of my heart in my chest. The mirror was shattered, the pieces still lying on the floor, but I knew something had changed. The reflection, it was still out there, waiting, and I knew it wasn't finished with me. The next morning, I begged my parents to leave. I told them everything, about the reflection, the whispers, the figure in the mirror, but they just looked at me, confused and concerned. "There's nothing there," my dad said gently. "It's just your imagination." But I knew that whatever it wasn't going to stop, because every time I looked into the mirror, it would be there, waiting for me, and it would keep coming closer until it had what it wanted, me. I never really believed in anything supernatural. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. My life was normal, uneventful even. I lived in a small town, worked a desk job in the city, and spent most of my evenings binge-watching Netflix or playing video games. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But that all changed one night. That night, I met the man who wasn't me. It started on an average Friday, the kind of day where you're just looking forward to the weekend. I had just finished a long work week and was planning to relax at home. I live alone, in a cozy little apartment in the city. It's quiet, peaceful, and I love it. But lately, I had been feeling a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched, like someone was always just outside of my view, waiting. I thought it was probably stress or just a lack of sleep. I had been working a lot lately, so I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me. That evening, after a quick dinner, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I live near a park, and sometimes just walking through the trees and listening to the sound of the wind helped me think. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, my footsteps echoing on the quiet street. As I walked through the park, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. It was beautiful, peaceful, but the feeling of unease still lingered in the back of my mind. I walked for a while, thinking about work, my life, everything. I was lost in thought when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Up ahead, there was a man standing under a street lamp. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a long coat that flapped in the breeze. At first, I thought it was just another person out for a walk, but something about him seemed off. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring into the distance. His face was turned away from me, so I couldn't see his expression. I kept walking, thinking nothing of it, but as I passed by, I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, that he knew exactly where I was. I quickened my pace, trying to brush off the discomfort, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was following me. I froze. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. But there he was, his silhouette against the fading light, moving in sync with me, just a few paces behind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I walked faster, hoping I was just imagining things. But when I turned down another path, I saw him again. He was still there, following me. No matter how fast I walked, no matter how many turns I made, he was always there, just behind me. I started running. My breath came out in short gasps as I sprinted toward the park entrance, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the exit, I turned around, expecting to see him right behind me. But there was no one. The park was empty. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was spinning. I had to be imagining things. There was no way someone had been following me. Maybe it was just the shadows, playing tricks on me. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to go home, not yet. So, I walked the long way around the block, trying to push the strange encounter out of my mind. When I finally arrived at my apartment, I checked the hallway and the stairwell before entering. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the night trying to relax, watching TV and scrolling through my phone. But even as I tried to unwind, I kept thinking about the man in the park. Who was he? Why was he following me? Was it just a coincidence? The next few days passed in a blur of work and routine. I couldn't focus like I used to, my mind always drifting back to that night. It didn't help that I kept seeing glimpses of the man in my peripheral vision. Every time I walked down the street, I would catch a glimpse of someone who looked just like him. But when I turned to look, no one would be there. It was as if I was imagining things, but it felt so real. Then, one night, everything changed. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. I didn't recognize the person standing on the other side. He was tall, with dark hair, and wearing a long coat. My heart skipped a beat. It was him, the man from the park. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Why was he here? What did he want? But then, I remembered the small peephole in the door. I was safe. I didn't have to open it. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That a stranger who looked like the man I saw in the park was standing outside my door? It didn't make sense. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, gravelly voice. "Let me in. I know you're in there." My blood ran cold. I stood still, listening, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to hide, but my legs wouldn't move. I said, "Let me in." Something about his voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a demand. There was something more to it, something that felt threatening. I pressed my back against the door, holding my breath. The knocking continued, but now there was something else. A scratching noise, like nails dragging against wood. I could hear it clearly, even over the pounding of my heart. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was as if he was trying to break through. "Please," I whispered, not sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. "Go away." I didn't answer the door. I didn't know what to do. The minutes dragged on like hours, the knocking never stopping, the scratching growing louder. It felt like the man outside was trying to get in, like he knew I was there, watching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I stood frozen, not daring to move, listening for any sign of him. There was silence, absolute silence. I waited for a few more minutes, just to be sure, before I dared to look through the peephole again. He was gone. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the hallway. There was no sign of him. No one was there. The hallway was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew something had changed. The man, the figure, wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't just a person from the park. It was as if he was me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears. What did he want? Why was he following me? And why did he look exactly like me? The next morning, I decided to confront it, to face whatever this was. I went to the park again, hoping to find some kind of explanation. As I walked through the same path I had taken that night, I spotted him again. He was standing by the street lamp, just like before. This time, I didn't walk away. I didn't run. I approached him slowly, my feet heavy on the ground. As I got closer, I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. When he turned to face me, I froze. It was me. Exactly me. Same face, same clothes, same expression. But his eyes, they were different. His eyes were cold, empty, and lifeless. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice shaky. He smiled, a twisted, knowing grin that didn't feel like mine. "Because you don't belong here," he whispered. "I do." And that's when I understood. He wasn't just following me. He wasn't just some random stranger. He was me, or at least he used to be. He was a reflection of everything I was, everything I'd ever been, only warped and twisted into something else, something darker. He was here to take my place, to become me, but I wouldn't let him. I turned and ran, not looking back, because I knew that as long as I kept running, as long as I kept fighting, he wouldn't catch me. Not yet, but deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. Eventually, he would catch up. I've never been the type of person who believes in the supernatural. Growing up, I was always a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, and otherworldly things? I considered them nothing more than stories to scare kids. But all of that changed the night I saw my doppelganger, the person who looked exactly like me, but wasn't me. It all started when I moved to a new city for college. It was my first time living away from home, and I was both excited and nervous. I had never been one to easily adjust to change, but I hoped the new environment would be different. The university was large, and my apartment was just a short walk away from the campus, in a quiet neighborhood that seemed peaceful enough. At first, everything seemed perfect. I didn't make many friends right away, which was fine with me. I preferred to spend my free time studying or reading, but something strange happened as the days passed. I started noticing people giving me odd looks. It wasn't anything too obvious, just brief glances, a sideways stare, and then they'd quickly look away. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I just looked like someone they knew. But one day, it got worse. I was at the library, studying for an exam, when I noticed a girl staring at me from across the room. She wasn't looking at me like she recognized me. She was looking at me like she was confused. I thought maybe I had something on my face, or perhaps I was sitting in her usual spot. But when I made eye contact with her, she quickly looked down at her book, almost as if she were embarrassed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But it wasn't until I saw her again the next day that I started to panic. I was sitting in a cafe on campus, sipping coffee and reading over my notes, when she walked in. The same girl. I thought nothing of it until she walked directly toward me, her eyes fixed on my face. She stopped in front of my table and stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. Are you real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked at her, confused. "What?" She took a step back, her hand on her chest like she had just seen a ghost. "I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else." I wanted to tell her she was just seeing things, that she had probably confused me with someone else, but something about her expression told me that she wasn't joking. "Who did you think I was?" I asked. She hesitated for a long moment, as if trying to find the right words. It's going to sound crazy," she said finally, "but you look just like my sister." Identical. I stared at her, feeling a strange sensation stir in my chest. "I don't have a sister," I replied, trying to laugh it off, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She apologized again, saying it was a mistake, and hurriedly left the cafe. I sat there, stunned and uneasy. What had just happened? How could I possibly look like someone's sister when I had no siblings? Over the next few days, more and more people started acting strangely around me. One girl in my history class practically jumped when she saw me. "Oh my God, you're alive," she said, her face pale as a sheet. "What?" I asked, bewildered. "I saw you at the mall 2 days ago. You were with some guy, but I don't know. I swear, it wasn't you," she explained, her voice trembling. "You looked like you, but you weren't you." I tried to brush it off as another mistake, a product of the busy college atmosphere where everyone looks the same in a crowd. But it was becoming more than that. That night, as I sat in my apartment, scrolling through social media, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A picture had been uploaded by a friend of mine. It was a picture from a party I hadn't attended. It was of me, but it wasn't me. In the photo, the person looked exactly like me. Same hair, same smile, same posture. But it was the eyes that made my blood run cold. The eyes in the photo were hollow, cold, unblinking. And the person in the photo was standing next to a man I didn't recognize, smiling, as if everything were normal. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I scrolled down, looking for any sort of explanation, but no one seemed to notice what was wrong. They all commented on how great I looked, how I was having such a good time at the party. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread. I began to see that person everywhere. They were in the background of photos with my friends, in places I had never been, wearing clothes I didn't own. It was like they were mimicking me, following me, living my life without me even knowing it. Then came the worst part. It happened late one night, when I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights outside. I had just closed my eyes when I heard a knock on the door. At first, I thought it was a figment of my imagination, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could it be at this hour? I peeked through the peephole, and my breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing in front of the door, their face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out their features, but I could tell they were tall, just like me. The moment I saw them, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I hesitated. Should I open the door? Who could this person be? The knocking came again, more forcefully this time. I stepped back, my mind racing. What if it was one of the people who had seen the doppelganger? What if they were looking for me, trying to figure out what was going on? Before I could make a decision, the door handle turned. I froze, my heart in my throat. The door was locked. I had locked it before going to bed, but the handle kept jiggling, as if someone was trying to force their way in. I stepped back slowly, fear creeping up my spine. I couldn't just let this happen. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaky as I explained what was going on. I didn't even know how to explain it. There's someone trying to break into my apartment. I don't know who they are, but it's not me. The knocking continued, and I heard a voice through the door. It was soft, almost whispering, but unmistakable. "Let me in. I need to see you." It was my voice, but it wasn't my voice. It was distorted, hollow. It sounded as if it had come from someone else, someone who wasn't me. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and there, standing in the doorway, was my doppelganger. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at the figure before me. It looked exactly like me, but there was something wrong with its eyes. They were empty, like two black pits staring back at me. It smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I had ever seen. The smile was wide, but it didn't reach its eyes. "I'm you," it said, its voice eerily calm. "I've been living your life while you've been asleep. I've been watching you." I backed away slowly, my body trembling with fear. No, you're not me," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm everything you wish you could be," it said, taking a step forward. "And I'm going to take your place." With that, it stepped into the apartment, the door swinging shut behind it. I ran. I didn't know what else to do. I ran to the window and tried to climb out, but my hands were shaking too much. It was too late. The figure had already cornered me. "I've been watching you for a long time," it said, its voice almost affectionate. "But now it's my turn to take over. You're weak. You're scared." "No," I whispered, trying to find the strength to fight back. "You're not me." The doppelganger smiled, its lips curling into a twisted grin. "I already am." And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't the one being watched. I was the one who had been replaced. The real me was already gone, and the one standing in front of me wasn't just a reflection. It was a sinister version of myself. The real terror had only just begun. I've always been a rational person. I believe in science, logic, and reason. Ghost stories? Superstitions? I dismissed them all as mere fantasies. But that all changed when I encountered something that no logic could explain. It started with a simple, innocent mistake, one that spiraled into something I could never have imagined. A mistake that led me to my doppelganger, a person who looked exactly like me, but wasn't me. And as I soon learned, this doppelganger had sinister intentions. It all began during the summer before my final year of college. I had just moved into a new apartment, hoping to start fresh. It was a cozy place, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. I had heard rumors that the building was old, but nothing that stood out as anything noteworthy. I was excited to have a space of my own and was looking forward to the independence it would bring. The apartment itself was small but charming, with a spacious living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a large window that offered a view of the city. I quickly settled in, unpacking my boxes and setting up my furniture. The first few days were uneventful, just the usual settling in routine. But then, on the fourth night, something strange happened. I had just finished dinner and was getting ready to watch a movie when I noticed something odd in my reflection. It was a quick glance, something I probably wouldn't have thought twice about if I hadn't been so distracted. But there, in the reflection of the window, I saw someone standing behind me. It was a man, tall, with dark hair. His face was hidden in the shadows, and for a moment, I thought it might be someone from the building, maybe a neighbor. I spun around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe my imagination playing with me, so I dismissed it. But the unease lingered, like a chill that wouldn't leave. The next night, the same thing happened. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through my phone, when I saw the same figure in the window's reflection. This time, I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I turned around immediately, but again, no one was there. The apartment was empty. There was nothing unusual about it. This time, I couldn't just brush it off. I went to the window and looked out, hoping to see something that would explain what I was seeing. Maybe someone walking down the street or a shadow from a passing car. But everything was still. No one was around. I spent the rest of the evening feeling uneasy, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days were just as strange. I would catch glimpses of that figure in the window again, always just out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes it was in the reflection of the window, other times in the mirror. Each time, I would turn to face it, but the moment I did, it would disappear. I decided to investigate. I checked every corner of the apartment, every closet, every door, to make sure I wasn't overlooking anything. I even went as far as calling maintenance to check if there were any issues with the windows or mirrors. They told me there was nothing wrong. But then things started escalating. I started seeing the figure more often, always in reflections, but never in person. It became a constant presence in my life. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, only to catch a glimpse of him standing at the foot of my bed in the mirror. His face was always blurred or obscured, but I could feel his presence. It was like he was watching me, waiting for something. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I didn't want to sound crazy. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then one night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I looked up at the bathroom mirror, and there he was, the same man I had seen in the reflections. But this time, he wasn't in the background. He was standing right next to me, his face inches away from mine, staring at me with cold, lifeless eyes. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at him, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. His expression didn't change. His eyes remained empty, like a void, a blackness that swallowed everything in its path. I reached out to touch the mirror, hoping to shatter the illusion, but my fingers passed right through it, as if the mirror was nothing but thin air. I recoiled, my heart racing. That's when I realized it. This man, this figure, he wasn't just a reflection. He wasn't just a trick of the light. He was me. He looked exactly like me. The same height, the same dark hair, the same features. But his eyes, they were empty, hollow. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel his presence, like he was just waiting for me to make the next move. That's when I heard his voice. It wasn't my voice. It was deeper, darker. It was full of malice. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure whispered, its voice sending a chill through my bones. I took a step back, my legs shaking. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I want what's mine," he replied, his smile twisted, unnatural. That's when I realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just some hallucination or trick of the mind. This was something else, something darker. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doppelganger, a twisted version of myself that had been slowly creeping into my life, waiting for the moment when it would replace me. I ran out of the bathroom, my mind racing. I didn't know where to go, what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in that apartment. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from whatever was trying to take my place. But as I hurried to the door, I saw something that made me freeze in my tracks. The figure. He was standing in the hallway, just outside my door. His eyes were empty, lifeless, but his smile was wide and twisted, like a predator savoring the moment before it struck. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've already seen too much. It's too late." I backed away slowly, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I tried to call for help, but the phone slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. I could feel him drawing closer, his presence suffocating. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The reflection in the mirror was not the only thing that had changed. The doppelganger had started to take over my life. It had been slipping into my world, slowly replacing the real me with its sinister self. It wasn't just in the mirrors or the reflections anymore. It was in my thoughts, my actions. It was becoming me. I had to get out. I had to escape before it was too late. But when I tried to open the door, I found it locked. The handle wouldn't budge. I turned around, and there he was again, standing in the doorway. He smiled that twisted smile, and I knew in that moment that it was over. "You can't escape me," he said softly, stepping forward. And that's when everything went dark. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, disoriented. I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. I looked around, expecting to see the doppelganger standing in the corner of the room, but there was nothing. It was as if the night had never happened. I got up and looked in the mirror, but when I saw my reflection, I almost couldn't believe it. My eyes were empty, hollow. My face was the same, but it felt like I wasn't really there. Like I was the one who had been replaced. The doppelganger had one, and now I was the reflection. I always thought I had a fairly normal life. I had a small group of close friends, a steady routine, and a job that didn't leave me much time for anything out of the ordinary. But everything changed the day I saw the photo. The day I saw someone who wasn't me, yet looked exactly like me, standing in a place I'd never been. It started innocently enough. My friend Sam had invited me to a weekend trip to the countryside. He had rented a cabin up in the mountains, a perfect spot for some peace and quiet, away from the city noise. I was looking forward to the break, the chance to relax, and maybe take a few nice photos for my social media. I'd been stressed from work, and a weekend getaway seemed like the perfect solution. We drove up to the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting the landscape in an eerie orange glow. The cabin itself was small and rustic, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It had that charming old-world feel, with wood-paneled walls and a large stone fireplace in the living room. There were only a few other houses nearby, tucked away in the hills, so the area felt isolated but peaceful. The first evening went smoothly: dinner, drinks, and a few rounds of board games. Sam and I caught up on life, and we talked about everything from work to old memories. But as night fell and the fire flickered out, an odd tension began to settle in the room. We were talking when Sam suddenly fell silent, staring at his phone. "Hey, is everything all right?" I asked, noticing his unusually pale face. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. I just found something strange," he muttered, holding out his phone to me. I looked at the screen. It was a photo from the trip, taken just a few minutes earlier, when we were standing outside the cabin, trying to get a good shot of the sunset. But something wasn't right. In the photo, Sam and I stood side by side, smiling at the camera, but behind us, in the distance, was a figure. Someone I didn't recognize. A man, standing at the edge of the forest. He wasn't there when I took the picture. I would have noticed him. "What the hell?" I whispered, squinting at the figure. He looked like a blurry shadow, but the shape was unmistakable. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and had a strange, unnerving posture, like he was watching us. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "That wasn't there when I took the picture, Sam. We were alone out there." Sam scrolled down through the photos on his phone. "I know, but look here," he said, pulling up another photo. It was one I had taken just moments before, but this time, the figure was closer, his face clearer. I gasped. The man in the photo was almost directly behind us, his face clear now. His features were sharp and cold, but it wasn't just his face that disturbed me. It was his eyes. They were hollow, dark, and empty, like black holes that swallowed everything in sight. He wasn't smiling, wasn't doing anything but standing there, staring at the camera with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Who is he? Have you seen him around?" Sam asked, his voice trembling slightly. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I haven't, but I swear, I didn't see him while we were out there." We both stared at the photos in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with unease. Something was wrong. I wasn't sure what, but I could feel it deep in my gut. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my heart racing. I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The room was still, silent. "Maybe it's just some weird trick of the light or something," I suggested, trying to push away the unease that was slowly creeping up on me. But Sam didn't look convinced. "Yeah, maybe," he said, though his voice was shaky. We decided to head to bed soon after that, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night was unusually quiet. No sounds of animals in the distance, no wind rustling through the trees. Just a thick, unnerving silence. The next morning, things only got worse. When I woke up, I immediately noticed something strange. The photos Sam had shown me last night were gone. I searched through his phone, checking every album, but there was no sign of them. The strange man, the photos from the night before, everything was gone. "Sam, where are the photos?" I asked, holding out his phone to him. "They aren't in your phone anymore." He looked confused, flipping through the screen. "I don't know. They were here last night. I didn't delete them. Maybe I accidentally swiped them or something." That's not possible. "We both saw them," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I didn't like the way things were unfolding. As we sat down for breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every time I glanced out the window, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching. But when I looked again, there was no one there. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Sam and I went on a short hike up the hills, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that photo, that figure. The way his eyes had seemed so familiar, so wrong. That night, Sam and I were sitting by the fireplace, having a few drinks, when I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. One of the framed photos hanging on the wall above the fireplace had changed. I wasn't sure when it happened, but I was certain it wasn't like that earlier. It was a picture we had taken together on a trip 2 years ago. Nothing special, just a photo of us at the beach, smiling at the camera. But now, the person standing next to me in the photo wasn't me. It was the man from the photo, the man with the hollow eyes. I jumped up, my heart pounding. "Sam, look at this," I said, pointing at the picture. "This photo has changed." The guy next to me. "It's not me." Sam took a few hesitant steps toward the photo. "What are you talking about?" "That's you in the picture." "No, it's not. That's the guy from the photos yesterday," I shouted. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the pictures of the man, trying to show Sam. But when I opened my gallery, I was met with an even worse surprise. All the photos of the strange man, the ones we had taken the night before, were gone. The frame on the wall rattled slightly, as if it were vibrating. A low, buzzing hum filled the room, and I felt a weight settle over me, thick and suffocating. Sam turned to me, his face pale. "I'm starting to get freaked out, man." I didn't know what to say. Nothing made sense. It was like the world was shifting around me. Like the man in the photos had always been there, but somehow his presence was becoming more real. And then, without warning, the lights in the cabin flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Sam?" I called out, my voice trembling. A loud thud came from the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed a flashlight from the side table and pointed it in the direction of the sound, but the beam illuminated nothing but the empty hallway. The door to the kitchen creaked open on its own, and the shadow of a person, tall, dark, and unmistakably familiar, stood there in the doorway. I gasped. It was him, the figure from the photos, standing in front of me in the flesh. His eyes were just as hollow, just as cold, but now I could see the details more clearly. His sharp jaw, his tall frame, his twisted grin. He stepped forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "You know," he said, his voice low and raspy, "I've been waiting for this moment." I backed away, my body frozen in terror. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the air. "It's time for you to go," he said, stepping closer. "You don't belong here anymore." I turned and ran, not knowing where to go, just needing to escape. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, and I could feel his presence behind me, growing closer with each step. But I couldn't escape him. As I ran, I realized the truth. The man in the photos, the figure in the shadows, wasn't just haunting me. He was me, or at least, the version of me that had been trying to replace me for so long. And now, I was the one being erased. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. The kind of night where the world feels still, like the calm before the storm. I was sitting on my couch, my laptop open in front of me, scrolling through the endless feed of social media posts, when I received an unexpected message from an unknown number. It was a text that simply read, "I'm outside." At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me, but something about the message made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. My apartment was on the second floor of an old building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was a peaceful neighborhood, and I didn't get many visitors, especially at this hour. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone standing below, waving up at me, but the street was empty. I set my phone down, dismissing the text, figuring it was some weird spam or joke. But the feeling that something was off lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I tried to focus on my work again, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the message. I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. A few minutes passed, and my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was more cryptic. "You won't believe who I am." I stood up, my heartbeat quickening. Something wasn't right. I walked over to the window and peered out again, but once again, the street was empty. No one was there. There was no car, no figure in the shadows, nothing. I decided to check my phone to see if I could trace the number, but when I pulled up the contact information, the message was gone. Vanished. I scrolled through my messages, searching for it, but it was as if the text had never been sent. My pulse raced as I stared at the blank screen. What was going on? I took a deep breath and tried to rationalize things. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe someone had just sent the wrong message to the wrong number. Maybe I was overthinking things. I was just about to return to my laptop when I heard a faint knock at the door. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who could that be? At this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the only people I knew who had a key were close friends or family, none of whom would ever come by unannounced like this. The knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. For a split second, I hesitated. Was this some sort of joke? Was someone messing with me? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My gut told me this wasn't normal. I opened the door. There, standing in the dim hallway, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, wearing a long coat that seemed out of place for the season. He was standing perfectly still, looking directly at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But what really struck me, what truly sent a shiver through my body, was the way he was smiling. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. His expression was almost too perfect. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I couldn't explain why, but something about him seemed familiar. Not in a way that I knew him, but in a way that made me feel like I should know him. "I think you know who I am," he said, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "But I've changed. You wouldn't recognize me now." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know you." The man took another step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "You don't, do you?" He suddenly reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek in a cold, deliberate motion. I flinched, my body recoiling from the touch as if it had been burned. There was something wrong about the way he touched me, like it wasn't really a human gesture, but something forced, something unnatural. Before I could say anything, the man spoke again, his voice now cold and detached. "You'll remember soon enough. It's time we had a little chat, don't you think?" I tried to slam the door in his face, but before I could, he pushed it open with a single motion. The force sent me stumbling back into my apartment, and I fell against the wall. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, panic rising inside me. "Get out!" I screamed, backing away from him. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped fully inside, his eyes never leaving mine, his expression unreadable. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had to get away from him. Something told me that if I didn't, I might never get out of this apartment again. I turned and ran, heading for the back door that led to the fire escape. I reached for the handle, but when I tried to pull it open, I froze. The door wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me as I yanked on the handle again and again, but it felt like it had been sealed shut. I turned around, desperate for another way out, but the man was already standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching me with that same chilling smile. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not until we finish what we started." My mind raced, but I couldn't think straight. I felt trapped, completely and utterly trapped. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head, as if considering my question. "I think you know," he said finally, "but I'll give you a hint. I'm not exactly who you think I am. And neither are you." His words hit me like a slap to the face. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man took a slow step toward me, his smile widening. "You've been seeing me for years, haven't you? In the mirror, in photographs, in dreams." I blinked, my mind reeling. "What? No, I've never seen you before." But as the words left my mouth, something in my memory shifted. There was a flicker, a sensation that didn't make sense. I had seen him before, hadn't I? In the reflection of my bathroom mirror, in the crowd at a concert, even in my own shadow, there had been a sense of familiarity. But I had always dismissed it, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination. The man stepped closer, his voice soft and mocking. "It's all right. You don't need to admit it just yet. But soon, you'll remember everything. Every moment we've shared. You'll remember that I am the real you." His words struck me like lightning. The real me? A sickening realization started to claw its way into my mind. The way he spoke, the way he looked at me, he wasn't just a stranger. He was me, or at least a version of me. A twisted, darker version that had been waiting in the shadows, biding its time until it was ready to take over. The fear that had been building in my chest turned to sheer terror. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something far worse. My doppelganger, my other self, had come to take my place, and I was helpless to stop it. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice growing colder. "You've already seen too much. You've already felt what it's like to be me." I backed away, my mind scrambling for a way out. But there was nowhere to go. No escape. No help. The man took another step forward, and that's when I realized the truth. He wasn't here to harm me. Not yet. He was here to replace me. To become the real me, the one everyone would recognize. And I would be the one left behind. Forgotten. Erased. "You can't do this," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "Please, I don't want to disappear." He didn't say anything. Instead, he reached out and touched my face again. This time, his touch felt colder than before, almost lifeless. And then, everything went dark. I never believed in supernatural things. Ghosts, spirits, and doppelgangers. They were all things to be brushed off, or so I thought. Until the day I moved into that apartment. It was the beginning of my second semester of college, and I had just found a new place to live. The rent was cheaper than most, and I was desperate to get out of the crowded dorms. The apartment was a small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an old building in a quieter part of town. The hallways were dimly lit, the floors creaked underfoot, and there was a general air of age and neglect about the place. But that's what I liked about it. Quiet, cozy, and private. I signed the lease and moved in quickly, excited to have my own space. The landlord, a quiet middle-aged man, seemed pleasant enough. He handed me the keys, made a few small talk comments about the building, and then left. I remember him saying, "You'll get used to the building's quirks. Just don't mind the old floors. They have a way of creaking even when no one's around." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just trying to be funny. I started unpacking my things, setting up my bed, desk, and kitchen. The apartment had an old-fashioned charm to it, with faded wallpaper and a vintage stove that probably hadn't been updated in decades. But it felt warm and comfortable. It was mine. The first few nights were uneventful. The creaks of the building as it settled at night were oddly soothing, and I quickly grew accustomed to them. But on the fourth night, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew. It was late when I decided to head to bed. I had finished my homework and was watching a few YouTube videos in bed when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, just a soft shuffling noise, like someone walking around in the next room. I thought it was the apartment next door. Maybe my neighbors had guests over. But then, the shuffling stopped and a low thud followed. I froze. The thud didn't come from the apartment next door. It came from the room directly next to mine, my own living room. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again. A muffled scrape, like a chair dragging across the floor. I had lived alone for just a few days, and I knew no one else was in the apartment with me. I got out of bed and slowly made my way to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I flipped the light switch, but the room was empty. Nothing had been disturbed. The chair was in its place, the furniture where I had left it. I laughed nervously at myself. "I'm just being paranoid," I muttered. "The building is old. It makes sounds." But then, something caught my eye. On the coffee table, there was a small picture frame I hadn't noticed before. It was an old, worn frame, with a faded black and white photograph inside. I walked over and picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was a picture of a woman. No, not just a woman. She looked exactly like me. She was standing in the same spot where I had been sitting earlier that evening, her eyes staring blankly into the camera. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, something from another time. But what made my blood run cold was how much she looked like me. Her face, her expression, even the way her hair fell around her shoulders. It was unnerving. I placed the picture back on the table, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant had left it behind. Maybe it was just a coincidence that she looked like me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The following days were a blur of strange events. The noises continued. Footsteps, muffled whispers, the occasional thud. And every time I would investigate, I'd find nothing. Yet the sense of unease was always there, lingering just out of sight. I started feeling like I wasn't alone in the apartment, like there was always someone in the next room. Then, on the sixth night, everything changed. I had just gotten home from class and was sitting at my desk, working on some assignments, when I heard the sound again. The shuffling, the low scrape. It was louder this time, more insistent. It came from my bedroom. My heart skipped a beat. I got up quickly and went to the door of my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my blood turned cold. The room was dark, but there, sitting on the bed, was a figure. Someone with dark, long hair, their back to me. I gasped, frozen in place. It was me. The figure on the bed was a perfect reflection of myself, but there was something wrong about her. Her posture was wrong, her movements stiff and mechanical. She didn't move or react when I entered the room. I stepped forward slowly, barely able to breathe. My voice caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure turned slowly, her face eerily similar to mine. But her eyes were empty, like two hollow voids. She stared at me with that same lifeless expression, and a chill ran down my spine. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. And then, in a voice that was almost too familiar, she spoke. "You don't belong here." The words sent a shockwave of terror through me. It was my voice, but twisted, hollow, like something was trying to mimic me, to replace me. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I managed to croak. The figure smiled, a cold, empty smile. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice now sharp and accusing. "You shouldn't have come here. This place is mine. You will leave." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my feet. I had to get out. I had to leave, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen, caught in her gaze. Her eyes were pulling me in, like a magnetic force I couldn't escape. I turned and ran, not knowing where to go, just needing to get away from her. But when I reached the door, I stopped in my tracks. The hallway outside my apartment was no longer the one I had come from. The walls were darker, the air thicker. The building seemed to stretch, twisting and bending in ways I couldn't understand. I looked over my shoulder and saw the figure standing at the end of the hallway, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She was no longer just sitting on the bed. She had moved, followed me, and now she was getting closer. "You're not getting away," she said softly, her voice echoing down the hallway. I turned and ran again, this time not caring about what direction I was going. But the hallway seemed endless, stretching on forever. No matter how far I ran, she was always there, just behind me, getting closer and closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. I found myself standing in my living room again, the apartment quiet and still. The photo frame was back on the coffee table, the woman's face staring up at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the figure, the woman in the photo, was now in the apartment with me. No longer just a reflection, but something real. I looked around, my mind reeling. What was happening? Had I gone mad? Was I imagining all of this? Or was there truly something sinister at work in the apartment? The woman in the photo was no longer just a figure in the background of my life. She was part of my reality. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't going to leave. I was no longer the one living here. She was. And I was the one who had been replaced. When I first moved into the old house on Briarwood Lane, I didn't think much of the rumors that swirled around the neighborhood. Most people said the house had a long history of strange occurrences. Neighbors whispered about the previous tenants, who had left without explanation, as well as the occasional flickering lights and mysterious sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. But, as a practical person, I chalked it up to old pipes, a worn-out foundation, and overactive imaginations. After all, Who had time for ghost stories and supernatural nonsense when you were busy with school, work, and life? The house itself was quaint, a two-story building that had clearly seen better days. The brick exterior was chipped, and the paint on the windows had faded in the sun. It was the kind of place that looked beautiful at first glance, but, upon closer inspection, revealed the slow deterioration of time. I didn't mind it, though. The rent was cheap, and it was close to everything I needed. The first few days went by without incident. I spent most of my time unpacking, cleaning, and settling in. The house creaked as old houses tend to do, but I found the sounds oddly comforting. It was a kind of welcome, a reminder that this was my space now. It wasn't until the third night that things started to take a turn. I was in bed, reading, when I first noticed it, a figure in the window. I live on the second floor, and my bedroom faces the street. I've always liked having a window next to my bed, so I can look outside if I wake up in the middle of the night. That night, I had a strange sensation, like something was watching me. I turned my head toward the window and froze. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure, a person, facing me. They were standing motionless, their features hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of their body and the faint reflection of the dim streetlights on the glass. At first, I thought it might have been a neighbor or someone walking by, but when I looked again, there was no one there. I figured it was my mind playing tricks on me, so I turned back to my book, dismissing it. The next few nights, it happened again. The figure would appear in the window at the same time, always just after I turned off the light to go to sleep. At first, I thought it was some sort of optical illusion, maybe caused by the trees outside moving in the wind or the lights from passing cars reflecting off the glass. But each time, the figure remained eerily still, its shape faint but unmistakable. It wasn't like a shadow or a passing reflection. It was solid, as though someone was actually standing there, looking into my room. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with a flashlight, I threw open the window and looked outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, had been standing there. But again, there was nothing. Just the empty street and the whisper of the wind. I closed the window and locked it, my heart racing, unsure of what to think. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination after a long day, I convinced myself, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Something felt off. That night, the strange occurrence took a terrifying turn. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body rigid with a feeling of unease. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. But this time, something was different. The figure was no longer outside. It was inside. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked over at the window. There, standing in the reflection on the glass, was a figure. Not outside this time, inside the room. It was a perfect reflection of me, standing at the foot of my bed, staring back at me with an expression I couldn't place. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. But before I could move, the figure in the reflection shifted. It raised its hand to the glass, pressing its palm against the window pane, mimicking my own movements, but in an eerily mechanical way. I could see the reflection of my own face now, but it wasn't mine. The eyes were darker, almost hollow, and the expression was twisted, cold and malicious. It was as if the reflection was mocking me. The longer I stared at it, the more I realized. The figure wasn't just copying my movements. It was moving on its own. With a sudden jolt, I turned to look at the actual window, but when I did, the room was empty. No one was standing at the foot of my bed. I looked back at the reflection in the glass. The figure was still there, staring at me, no longer mimicking my movements but doing things I wasn't. My stomach dropped as I realized that the reflection was no longer mine. It was someone, or something else. I bolted out of bed and ran into the hallway, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. The house felt colder now, darker. I grabbed my phone from the living room and tried to call my best friend, but the signal was out. The house seemed to swallow up all the sound, making it feel even more oppressive. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the reflection in the window. It wasn't me. It was someone else. I spent the next few days in a fog. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My nerves were shot, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I passed a mirror, I felt the eerie presence of someone watching me from behind. But when I turned around, no one was there. One evening, I decided I needed to get to the bottom of it. I called my landlord and asked if anyone else had lived in the apartment recently. He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Well, yes. There was another tenant, a young woman. She was here just a few months ago, but she left in a hurry. No one really knows why. She left all her belongings behind. Didn't even come to pick them up." I asked if I could see her things, hoping for some clue about what had happened. But the landlord told me it was all packed away in storage. He warned me that the house had a history of strange events, but nothing that could be explained logically. That night, I went into the storage room where the previous tenant's belongings had been kept. There, stacked on top of old furniture and boxes, I found a small leather-bound photo album. It looked old, worn, as if it had been handled too many times. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The first few pages were filled with pictures of a woman I didn't recognize. She looked like me, but with slight differences. Her features were softer, her smile more strained. She was always standing in front of mirrors or windows in the photos, and in every one of them, her eyes were dark, too dark, like they were hollow. I flipped through more pages, feeling a growing sense of dread, until I came across a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the woman standing in front of my bedroom window, the same room I now slept in. Her expression was vacant, almost like she was in a trance, and her eyes stared straight into the camera. But in the reflection on the glass, I could see myself, standing behind her, staring right at her. I dropped the album, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That night, I returned to my apartment, terrified of what I had just discovered. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. My face, but twisted, with those cold, empty eyes staring back at me. I knew she was here. She was in the reflection, in the window, waiting. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't just a doppelganger. She was trying to take me, replace me. She was moving closer every night, waiting for the right moment. I don't know how long I lasted in that house. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up everything I could carry and left. The landlord offered no comfort, no explanation. He simply said, "I told you, the house doesn't like to let people go." To this day, I still don't understand what happened in that house. All I know is that I haven't looked into a reflection since, and I haven't been able to escape the feeling that she's still out there, watching, waiting, somewhere, in the shadows, trying to find her way back into my life. And I know one day, she'll come, she'll find me, and when she does, I won't be able to outrun her anymore. I used to think that doppelgangers were just the stuff of creepy stories or urban legends. I always believed that the notion of someone out there who looked exactly like you was just a silly, superstitious myth. After all, how could there be someone who looked like me? Someone with my exact face, my exact features? That was impossible, right? Well, I found out the hard way that some things are better left unexplored, and some questions are best left unasked. It all started on a regular Tuesday evening. I had just finished a long day of school and was looking forward to some downtime. I lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an aging building. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I enjoyed the peace and quiet it provided. There was a routine to my life that I appreciated, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. On this particular evening, I sat down on the couch, my laptop open in front of me, scrolling through social media while sipping on a glass of water. I was tired but felt content in my solitude. There had been no weird occurrences or strange happenings lately. That night was just another in a long string of uneventful nights, until I noticed something strange. I had a small, full-length mirror positioned in the corner of my living room. It wasn't a fancy mirror, just an old one I had found at a secondhand store. I never really thought much about it until I glanced at it as I sat on the couch. For a split second, I saw a figure in the reflection. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The figure in the mirror wasn't a stranger. It was me, but it wasn't. I was sitting on the couch, but in the reflection, I was standing in the corner of the room. The figure looked exactly like me. same dark brown hair, same blue eyes, but the posture was off. The person in the reflection was standing unnaturally still, staring at me with a blank expression. It was unsettling, like a person who had no life behind their eyes. I blinked and the figure was gone. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was just tired and imagining things. After all, I had been staring at the screen for hours, and sometimes my eyes played tricks on me. But the feeling of unease lingered. The next night, the same thing happened. I was sitting in the same spot, on the same couch, when I saw the figure again in the reflection of the mirror. This time, the figure wasn't just standing still. It was moving. It was me, but the way it moved was wrong. The figure twisted its head unnaturally, almost as if it was trying to look directly at me. It wasn't a natural movement, like a normal person moving. It was jerky, as though controlled by something other than my own body. The eyes were wide open, unblinking, and that cold expression on its face never changed. I leaped up from the couch, the glass of water slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. My breath was shallow, and panic shot through my chest. My hands trembled as I reached for the mirror, but there was nothing there. No figure, just my own reflection staring back at me. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, maybe hallucinating. I had been studying hard for exams and hadn't been sleeping well, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The third night was the worst. I had gotten into bed, exhausted from my day, and was about to fall asleep when I heard a soft scratching sound from the living room. I wasn't sure what it was at first, so I just brushed it off. But the scratching came again, this time louder, more insistent. I was too scared to get up and check, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a long few minutes, I finally summoned the courage to get out of bed. I walked toward the living room, my heart pounding. As I passed the mirror, I saw the figure again. But this time, it wasn't in the reflection. It was behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat. The figure, my reflection, was standing in front of me, inches from my face. The eyes that stared at me were wide and unblinking, like they were studying me, waiting for something. Then it smiled. The smile wasn't mine. It was wide, almost grotesque, and its lips curled unnaturally. My legs turned to jelly, and I stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me. My body was frozen in fear. It was as if the reflection was alive, and it was trying to reach out to me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed in place. The reflection was still there, but its smile was now turning into something more sinister. It was as though the figure was mocking me, mimicking my every move, but with a twisted, malicious intent. It raised its hand to the mirror, and I could see my own hand raise at the same time. But the reflection's hand moved faster, its fingers stretching unnaturally as if it was about to reach through the glass. That's when I ran. I ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the night. I didn't care that it was freezing cold, or that I didn't have my coat. I just had to get away. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran aimlessly through the streets, hoping that if I could get far enough away, I would be safe. It was hours before I gathered the courage to return to my apartment. The whole time, I kept thinking about the reflection, my reflection, smiling that cruel smile, its eyes following me. But when I finally returned, I found my apartment untouched. No sign of the figure, no sign of anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching, waiting. Over the next few days, I began to notice other things. I would see my reflection in mirrors, in windows, in puddles of water, but it wasn't always me looking back. There were times when it was smiling, or frowning, or staring at me with hollow eyes. It was as though my reflection had developed a mind of its own, a will separate from mine, and it wasn't always harmless. On one occasion, I was standing in front of a bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, when my reflection suddenly stopped moving. It just stood there, staring at me, not mimicking my actions. And then, I saw it smile again. But this time, the smile wasn't just twisted, it was malicious. Its eyes gleamed with something dark, something I couldn't understand. I backed away slowly, terrified, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, watching me, as if it had all the time in the world. I knew then that it wasn't just a mirror. It was something else, It wasn't just a doppelganger. It was something that wanted to take my place. It wanted to replace me, to trap me in that glass and leave me behind. That night, I called a friend, desperate for someone to talk to, someone who could help me understand what was happening. They agreed to come over, and when they arrived, I showed them the mirror. I expected them to laugh, to tell me I was just imagining things. But when they looked into the mirror, they froze. "What's wrong?" I asked. They didn't answer at first. Instead, they stared at my reflection, my smiling, blank-eyed reflection. I could see the terror slowly creeping into their face, the realization setting in that something was wrong. They turned to me and whispered, "It's not you." I tried to laugh it off, but deep down, I knew the truth. That thing in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just a doppelganger. It was something else, something sinister. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the reflection in my mind, that smiling, hollow-eyed version of me that seemed to haunt my every thought. I decided to leave. I packed up my things and moved out of the apartment, but the moment I stepped away, I felt the pull. I felt it following me, watching me from the distance. The smile, the eyes, always there, always waiting. And to this day, I wonder if it's still out there. My reflection, that thing that wanted to replace me. Because no matter how far I run, I know it will find me again. I just hope it's not too late. It was the kind of night that felt like it was stretching on forever. Cold, eerie, and oddly still. My name is Sarah, and I've always been the sort of person who prided myself on being a practical thinker. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything that went bump in the night. That was all just nonsense, right? But one night, everything changed. And it wasn't a ghost I encountered. It was something far worse. Something much more real. I had just turned 18 and was starting my first year of college. The new semester had begun, and I had decided to rent a small apartment on the outskirts of town to be closer to campus. The place was quiet, tucked away between trees, and honestly, I loved it. It was my sanctuary. I was thrilled to have a space all to myself, where I could unwind after long days of lectures, studying, and the occasional social event. But as much as I loved the peace and seclusion, there was something off about the apartment. It was an old building, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had seen too many people come and go. There were strange creaks at night, some from the settling of the old wood floors, others from deeper within the walls, like something, or someone, was moving around. I tried not to dwell on it. Everyone said I was being paranoid. College life was stressful, and I was probably just tired. But the feeling never fully went away. It was around midnight when I first saw it. I had just finished up a long study session and was getting ready to call it a night. The apartment was dark except for the soft light of my desk lamp. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and then crawled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. The wind howled outside, and the rain pattered softly against the windows, but I felt safe. I closed my eyes, ready to drift into sleep. Then I heard it, a soft knock at my door. It was faint, almost imperceptible. I hesitated, thinking I must be imagining it. Who would be knocking at my door at this hour? But the knock came again, slower this time, deliberate, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I got out of bed and walked hesitantly to the door, wondering if it might be a neighbor or some sort of mistake. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway outside was dark, silent. Confused, I opened the door, my hand trembling slightly on the handle, but no one was there. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit by a flickering light. I stepped out, looking around. Nothing. The door to the other apartment was shut, and the stairwell was quiet. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But as I stood there in the dim light of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't long before I realized I was being watched. I couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like eyes were on me, watching me from somewhere in the apartment. I checked all the windows, all the closets, all the corners of the room, but nothing was out of place. Still, the sensation lingered. I tried to shake it off, climbing back into bed, closing my eyes and forcing myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come. That's when I saw it. It started as a shadow in the corner of the room, a dark figure, just out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was my imagination, maybe a trick of the light, but then it moved. Slowly at first, creeping closer to my bed. I froze. The figure wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just a dark shape, it was alive. It shifted and wavered, as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. The air in the room grew colder, and the darkness seemed to thicken. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, as the figure neared the bed, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart, racing in my chest. I tried to move, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own skin. And then, it spoke. It was a voice, soft and familiar. But it was wrong. So wrong. It sounded like me, but deeper, darker, twisted somehow. The voice whispered my name, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring each syllable. Sarah. The voice said, just a whisper at first, then louder. It's time to meet your twin. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more solid, more defined. It looked like me. Same face, same eyes, same hair. But there was something horribly wrong about it. The thing that looked like me smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, predatory, like a wolf grinning at its prey. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and I felt like it could see straight into my soul. And that's when I understood. It wasn't just a reflection of me. It was something darker, something twisted, a doppelganger. Before I could do anything, it reached out. Its hand stretched toward me, its fingers too long, too thin. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever was about to happen. But the next thing I knew, I woke up. I was lying in my bed, the room quiet, the air warm. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by stress. I sat up, shaking my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. That's when I saw it. The reflection in my bedroom mirror wasn't mine. I stood frozen, staring at the mirror across the room. The figure in the glass was me, but not quite. It was like a perfect copy of me. Same clothes, same hair, same everything. But its eyes were cold and empty. And then, just like before, it smiled that sinister grin. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the reflection moved. It didn't mimic my movements like a normal reflection. No, it moved on its own, like it was alive, like it was doing something separate from me. It raised its hand and pressed it against the mirror, exactly like the figure from my nightmare had. And that's when I realized the doppelganger wasn't just some bad dream. It was real. I ran out of my apartment, slamming the door behind me, not caring about anything else. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay there. Not with it in the mirror, watching me, waiting for its moment to replace me. I wandered the streets for hours, not knowing what to do. But every time I looked at a reflective surface, whether it was a window, a shop display, or even a puddle on the sidewalk, I saw it. My doppelganger, always watching, always waiting. I spent days and a days, trying to outrun my own reflection, trying to escape whatever it was that had come into my life. It was always there, lurking just behind the glass, staring at me with those hollow, empty eyes. I don't know how long I lasted before I reached the breaking point. Eventually, I found myself back in the apartment, exhausted and desperate for some semblance of normalcy. I didn't know what had happened to me, or why it had chosen me, but the feeling of being watched, of being replaced, never left. Then one day, I found something that chilled me to my core. A photograph of myself, sitting on my bed, taken from across the room. It was taken from the mirror. I don't know who or what took the picture, but I do know one thing. It's still out there, and it's still waiting for its moment to step through the mirror, to take my place, to be me. And every time I look in the mirror, I wonder, will this be the moment it finally happens? Will it take over, and I'll never be seen again? Or is it already too late? The thing that looks like me is still out there, and it's getting closer. My name is Jacob, and for as long as I can remember, I've been a skeptic. I grew up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, and was always more interested in science and facts than in supernatural tales. Ghosts, demons, and strange occurrences were things that happened in horror movies and books, not in real life. I often scoffed at people who believed in them, thinking they were either imagining things or simply looking for attention. But one night, one strange, terrifying night, everything I thought I knew about reality was turned upside down. It started a few weeks ago when I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. I had recently started my job at a tech company and needed a place to live closer to work. The apartment I found was small, but it was all I could afford. It was in a relatively quiet building with old, creaky floors and a somewhat musty smell, but nothing unusual. I unpacked my things and settled into my new routine, and for the first couple of weeks, life seemed ordinary. That was until the night of the incident. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had been working late at the office. The moon was barely visible in the sky, hidden behind thick clouds. As I walked back to my apartment, I had always been a night owl, so the silence of the late evening never bothered me. In fact, I often enjoyed it. But this time, something felt off. The air was thicker, heavier. It almost felt like the entire world was holding its breath. I shrugged off the feeling as I unlocked the door to my apartment. As I stepped inside, I noticed that something was different. The air in the room felt colder than usual, and the dim light from the hallway cast eerie shadows across the walls. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I immediately felt like I wasn't alone. My heart raced a little faster than usual, and my instinct was to look around, as though expecting someone to jump out at me. "Must be the stress," I muttered under my breath. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and set my backpack down. I went to the bathroom to wash up and try to shake off the strange feeling. But that's when I saw it. As I walked past the bathroom mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. My reflection was the same as always: tired eyes, scruffy hair, and the faintest stubble on my chin. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't seem to match my movements. My face was slightly distorted, twisted into an expression I didn't recognize. I stopped and stared at the mirror, my heart starting to race again. The reflection wasn't mimicking me. It was ahead of me. My reflection seemed to be smiling, a cold, calculating grin that I never wore. I shook my head, convinced it was just exhaustion or my eyes playing tricks on me. But when I blinked, the smile on my reflection's face widened, as though it knew something I didn't. I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't. I went back to the kitchen and began making dinner, trying to distract myself from the strange experience. But the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't explain it. It was like the apartment had become a cage, and I was trapped inside it with something that wasn't quite right. As I ate, I noticed the lights flicker. It was subtle at first, just a quick flash of dimness, but it kept happening every few minutes, growing more frequent. I stood up, annoyed. This building was old, sure, but this was the first time I'd noticed anything like this. Maybe I'm just tired, I thought, grabbing my phone to check the time. It was 10:23 p.m. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten. Still, the flickering lights continued to bother me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. And then, I heard something soft, like the sound of footsteps. I froze. I was alone in the apartment. I was sure of it. The only other tenant in the building was Mr. Harrison, an elderly man who lived 2 floors below. I had never seen him leave his apartment in all the time I'd lived here. So who was making those footsteps? I crept toward the living room, my heart pounding. The apartment was small, and the living room led directly into the hallway, where the bedrooms were. I moved cautiously, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the far end of the hallway, barely illuminated by the flickering light from the kitchen, was a figure. It was me, or rather, it looked like me. The figure was identical in every way. Same clothes, same height, same build. But it was wrong. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Was I seeing things? Was this a dream? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog, but the figure remained. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just stared at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. "Hello?" I called out cautiously. My voice trembled, betraying my fear. The figure didn't respond, but it did something that made my blood run cold. It smiled. That same cold, sinister grin I had seen in the mirror earlier. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, and every instinct I had was telling me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, without warning, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it started walking toward me, its step silent, its face still wearing that disturbing grin. Every step it took felt heavier than the last, the air growing colder, thicker with each moment. It was as though the very atmosphere in the room was shifting, bending around the figure. My heart hammered in my chest, and I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the thing that looked like me. I bolted toward the front door, my breath ragged, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice that sent a chill down my spine. "Where are you going, Jacob?" I froze. It was my voice, but it wasn't the voice I knew. It was colder, deeper, and more menacing. It felt wrong, like it was coming from somewhere dark and far away. I slowly turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward me, its eyes locked on mine, and it wasn't smiling anymore. Now, its face was blank, empty, hollow, like it had no soul. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I had to get out. I had to escape. I swung open the door and ran down the hallway, desperate to get out of the building. But when I reached the stairs, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but there was nothing. I turned back to the stairs and saw something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the stairs, standing in the shadows, was the same figure. But this time, it wasn't just standing still. It was grinning, that same twisted smile spreading across its face. And then, it spoke again. "Jacob, it's too late." The figure's eyes glowed, and before I could react, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor. The door was still open, and the hallway was empty. My heart raced in my chest, and I could still feel the terror in the pit of my stomach. I stood up, shakily, and looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something was horribly wrong. That thing, my doppelganger, was real. It had followed me, and it was still out there. The reflection I had seen in the mirror, the figure in the hallway, the voice. It was all part of the same thing. It was trying to replace me, to take my place. I wasn't sure if it had succeeded yet, or if it was waiting for the perfect moment, but I knew one thing for certain. The figure would never stop. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to step forward and take over. And no matter how far I ran, I could never escape it. My name is Emily. I'm just an ordinary girl. Nothing special about me, really. I've always been the kind of person who preferred books over movies and staying at home over going out. I've never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. My life was simple, and I was perfectly content with it. That was until one fateful evening when I encountered something I never could have imagined. My own doppelganger. It all started on a quiet Friday night, just like any other. I was home alone in my small apartment, having just finished a long week of school and work. The evening was crisp, with a slight chill in the air, and the streetlights outside flickered intermittently, casting a soft glow through the windows. I was in the mood to relax, so I made a cup of tea, lit a scented candle, and curled up on the couch to watch my favorite TV show. As the hours passed, I felt the weight of exhaustion beginning to settle in. My eyelids grew heavy, and I decided it was time to call it a night. I turned off the TV and headed toward the bathroom to brush my teeth before bed. The hallway light flickered as I passed, but I thought nothing of it. It had been doing that for days. After brushing my teeth, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection as I wiped the steam from the glass. My face looked tired, the dark circles under my eyes more prominent than usual. I was just about to walk away when something caught my attention. For a split second, my reflection didn't move with me. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. Maybe I was too tired to notice. But then, I saw it clearly. In the mirror, my reflection stayed still while I continued to wipe my face. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the glass as my reflection slowly smiled. It wasn't my smile. The grin on my reflection's face was wide, but it was colder, darker. It wasn't the friendly, tired smile I'd seen earlier in the night. It was as if my reflection was mocking me, trying to communicate something sinister. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I blinked, and my reflection returned to normal. It was like nothing had happened. My face was as it should be, plain, tired, and human. I shook my head, trying to shake off the strange feeling. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe I had been staring at myself too long. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. But as I turned away from the mirror and left the bathroom, something felt off. The silence in the apartment felt heavier, almost suffocating. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. I went to bed, trying to forget about the strange incident, but sleep eluded me. The image of my distorted reflection lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I tossed and turned, the unease growing with every passing minute. I thought about getting up and turning on the TV to distract myself, but my body felt paralyzed, as if something was holding me in place. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft sound. A tap. It came from somewhere deep inside my apartment, but it was faint, almost like a knock. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to listen. Another knock, louder this time. It was coming from the bathroom. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to go investigate. I told myself it was just the pipes, or maybe the wind tapping against the windows. But my gut told me something was wrong. I didn't dare look toward the bathroom. It was as if I could feel something. Someone waiting for me. The knocking continued, each tap getting louder and more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet brushing the cold floor, and walked toward the bathroom, every step heavier than the last. As I reached the door, I hesitated. The bathroom light was dim, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. My pulse quickened. My mind screamed at me to turn around, but my feet moved forward. I pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. The mirror stood there, reflecting the dim light, but everything else seemed normal. I sighed in relief, but my heart was still pounding. That's when I saw it. In the mirror, standing behind me, was another version of me. I spun around quickly, but there was no one behind me. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there. It looked exactly like me. Same hair, same clothes, but its face was twisted in an expression I didn't recognize. It smiled at me, but it was a wicked, knowing grin that sent a chill down my spine. The reflection didn't move with me. Instead, it stood there, staring back at me, as though it was waiting for something. The fear that shot through me was paralyzing. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the reflection was alive, watching me, and that's when I realized this wasn't just a trick of the light. The figure in the mirror wasn't a reflection. It was something else, something that was trying to take my place. Suddenly, the smile on the reflection's face disappeared, replaced by a look of malice. It tilted its head slightly, as if to study me. Then, slowly, it raised its hand and placed it on the mirror's surface. It was my hand, but the movements were different, deliberate, slow, as though it wasn't trying to mimic me but rather mock me. In a flash of panic, I stumbled backward, knocking over a bottle of shampoo from the counter. I reached for the door, but my hand trembled as I tried to grasp the doorknob. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection in the glass, my doppelganger, didn't follow my movements this time. It stayed perfectly still, watching me with that eerie grin. I bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me, and ran back to my bedroom. I locked the door and crawled into bed, shaking uncontrollably. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had been sleep-deprived and scared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something not human. I lay in bed for hours, unable to sleep. Every creak of the apartment sent a jolt of fear through me. The quiet darkness was suffocating. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to look around. But the longer I lay there, the more the fear seemed to grow. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. That thing in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was real. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. I called in sick to work and tried to distract myself with anything I could. Books, music, TV shows. But the fear kept creeping back. Every time I glanced in the bathroom mirror, I saw that figure, standing just behind me, waiting. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't real, that it was just a product of my overactive imagination. But I knew deep down that I was no longer alone in that apartment. And worse, I was terrified that the longer I stayed there, the more that thing would grow, the more it would take over. It was as if it was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right time to step out of the mirror and into my life. I began avoiding mirrors altogether. I started covering them with sheets, anything to keep from seeing that thing staring back at me. But no matter what I did, I always felt its presence lurking just behind me, waiting for the day it would take my place. That's the thing about doppelgangers. They're not just reflections of us. They're darker versions, twisted and wrong. And once they find their way into your life, they never leave. They're always there, watching, waiting for the moment when they'll finally step out of the shadows and replace you. And that moment could be any time. My name is Sarah, and I've never been one to believe in supernatural things. I was always a practical person, someone who needed evidence before I would believe in something strange. Growing up, I was the kind of kid who would scoff at ghost stories and laugh when someone claimed to have seen something otherworldly. But that all changed a few months ago when I came face to face with something I couldn't explain, my own doppelganger. It started on a Saturday afternoon, a day just like any other. I had just finished a long week of work and was looking forward to a quiet weekend at home. My apartment was small, cozy, and on the third floor of a building in the city. The view from my window overlooked a small park where children played and people walked their dogs. It was peaceful, and I loved how calm it felt. I had no reason to believe that anything out of the ordinary would ever happen there. On that Saturday, I decided to spend the afternoon cleaning and organizing my apartment. It wasn't a big task, but it kept me busy, and I found it oddly satisfying. After a few hours, I decided to take a break and sit down with a cup of tea. I grabbed my favorite mug, filled it with hot water, and made my way to the living room. I sat on the couch, sipping my tea and scrolling through my phone, trying to decide what to do for the rest of the day. It was about 3 p.m. when I noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in my hallway. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps I was imagining things. But when I looked up, my heart stopped. There, in the hallway, stood a woman who looked exactly like me. It wasn't just that she looked like me. She was me. Her face was identical to mine. Her height, her clothes, everything was exactly the same. But something about her seemed off. Her eyes were too wide, her posture too rigid, and her smile, it wasn't mine. It was cold, empty, and full of malice. It was as though she wasn't just copying me, but mocking me. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was I hallucinating? But no, I was wide awake, and the woman in front of me was real. I watched, paralyzed, as she slowly started walking toward me, her movements unnervingly calm and deliberate. She didn't speak a word, but I could feel the weight of her presence in the room. It was like she was waiting for something. But what? She stopped right in front of me, still smiling that unsettling grin. I was too scared to do anything. My body felt like it was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was identical to mine, but there was a sharp, menacing edge to it that made my blood run cold. Do you really think you can escape? I didn't understand what she meant. Escape from what? My confusion was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. Real footsteps, not from the hallway. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I snapped my head back to the woman in the hallway. She was still standing there, but now she was closer. She hadn't moved. She hadn't taken a step forward, but now she was right in front of me, her face just inches from mine. She reached out slowly, as if to touch my face, but before she could, I screamed and ran out of the apartment. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I just needed to get away from that thing that looked like me. I ran down the stairs of the building, out into the street. I could feel the cool air against my skin, but it didn't matter. I kept running, my heart still racing in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. After several blocks, I stopped, leaning against a lamppost to catch my breath. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I was still shaking, my mind struggling to make sense of the events that had unfolded. I told myself it was all just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. It felt too real. I spent the next few hours walking around, trying to clear my head. I didn't want to go back to my apartment, but I knew I would eventually have to. The sun was beginning to set, and I reluctantly made my way back home. When I entered the building, everything seemed normal. The hallway was quiet, the lights flickering as usual. But as I reached my apartment door, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The air was heavier, colder, like something was waiting for me inside. I slowly turned the doorknob and stepped into my apartment. It was dark, but the faint light from the street outside filtered through the blinds. I walked toward the living room, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of the woman who looked like me. There was nothing. The apartment was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just stress or a trick of the mind. I walked into the kitchen to make myself some dinner, trying to push the terrifying experience out of my mind. But then, I saw it again. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the doorway to the kitchen. I froze. It was her again. This time, she was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at me with that same twisted smile. Her eyes were glowing now, a pale, sickly yellow, and she wasn't just smiling. She was grinning, her teeth sharp and unnaturally white against the darkness of the room. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't freeze. I bolted out of the kitchen and toward the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I realized that it was no longer just my doppelganger standing in the hallway. There were more. 2 more. 3. I couldn't count them all. They were standing there, in the hall, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. "Where are you going, Sarah?" one of them asked, her voice a twisted version of my own. My stomach dropped. I could feel my knees shaking. I turned and ran, but I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, they were always there, watching me. I don't remember much after that. It's like the world went dark, and I woke up hours later on the floor of my apartment, my head throbbing, my body numb. The apartment was still, but the sense of unease hadn't gone away. It was like they were still there, watching me. It's been weeks since that night, but things haven't gotten better. I still see them sometimes. My doppelganger and her twisted versions, staring at me from the shadows. I can't shake the feeling that they're always just around the corner, waiting for the moment when they'll take my place. I don't sleep much anymore. I avoid mirrors at all costs, and I always check the hallway before I leave my apartment. The fear is constant, and it's slowly eating away at me. I can't escape them. They're always there, waiting, watching, stalking me. And I know the worst part. They're getting closer. My name is Olivia, and I'm still trying to understand this series of events that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. What started as a typical afternoon became the beginning of something I couldn't escape, a nightmare that has followed me ever since. I had just turned 18 when everything started to unravel. I was living in a small apartment near my high school, independent for the first time in my life. My parents had just moved out of state for work, leaving me to finish school alone. I was excited to have my own space, to make my own decisions without anyone hovering over me. But I never expected that my new freedom would lead me into something so terrifying, something so impossible. The first strange thing happened on a rainy Friday evening, just a few weeks after my birthday. I had just gotten home from a long day of classes and errands. I had dinner, then decided to get comfortable and watch some movies to unwind. I was flipping through channels when I caught a glimpse of myself on the screen. It wasn't in a reflection, but on the television show I was watching. I didn't think much of it at first, just a character who looked a bit like me, probably a coincidence. But the more I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. The woman on screen was doing everything I was doing at that exact moment. She was sitting on a couch, just like I was. She had the same black hoodie and jeans, the same messy hair, even the same tired expression on her face. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, frozen. I thought maybe it was some clever trick of editing or a mistake in the program, but no, it wasn't. The woman on the screen wasn't just a look-alike. She was me. I turned off the TV immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. What was going on? How could there be someone on a TV show who looked exactly like me? I told myself it was just a bizarre coincidence, a trick of lighting or camera angles. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. The following days were filled with strange occurrences, things I couldn't explain. I began seeing glimpses of that woman, the one who looked like me, almost everywhere. I saw her in store windows, walking down the street, standing in the reflection of windows as I passed by. Every time I caught a glimpse, I would look away quickly, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. One night, as I was walking home from a friend's house, I saw her again. This time, I was sure of it. She was standing across the street, looking directly at me. Her hair was damp from the rain, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to move. Her expression was dark, as if she were waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just someone who happened to look like me. But as I crossed the street and walked closer, I realized she wasn't just looking at me. She was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, cold, and unsettling. I quickened my pace, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on mine, following me with her gaze. As I reached my apartment building, I glanced over my shoulder. She was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, and sat on my couch, trying to calm myself. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside. Footsteps, whispers, faint scratching sounds on the walls. My heart raced each time I heard it, convinced that she was out there, waiting. I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. There was a pattern to these encounters, and it felt like she was getting closer, like she was always one step ahead of me. The next day, I decided to go to the library, hoping the quiet atmosphere would help me clear my mind. As I was browsing the shelves, I saw her again. This time, she wasn't across the street or in the reflection of a window. She was standing in front of me, in the middle of the library aisle. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was her, my doppelganger. She was wearing the same clothes, had the same hair, and the same cold, empty expression. My breath caught in my throat. She didn't say anything, but I could feel her eyes boring into me, watching me, studying me. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest as I tried to move away, but my legs felt frozen. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, smiling that twisted smile, as if she knew I was going to try to leave. In a sudden panic, I turned and ran. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape her. She was always there, always one step behind me, her eyes following my every move. That night, I locked all the windows and doors in my apartment, afraid to even look outside. The dread was suffocating, and every creak in the building sent my nerves into overdrive. I stayed awake all night, terrified that she would appear again, but nothing happened. It was quiet, too quiet. I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe I was just stressed out, overworked, or perhaps I had been seeing things. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Something about that woman, that thing that looked like me, was not normal. The next day, I decided to confront it. I couldn't keep running from something that I didn't understand. I went back to the library, determined to find answers. I spent hours searching the stacks for anything about doppelgangers, spirits, or strange occurrences, but I couldn't find anything that made sense. It was getting dark when I finally left, my mind still swirling with questions. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand what was happening. As I walked back to my apartment, the streets were nearly empty, and the air felt colder than it should have been. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and the familiar sensation of being watched crept over me again. I rounded a corner and froze. There she was. Standing in the middle of the street, under a streetlight, was the woman who looked like me. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her smile, oh, that smile. It was no longer twisted. It was just wrong. It was almost as if she were enjoying my fear, savoring it. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, turning and running as fast as I could. This time, there was no stopping, no looking back. My feet pounded against the pavement, my lungs burning as I sprinted toward my apartment. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel her presence behind me, always just out of reach. I made it back to my building, slamming the door shut behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling. She was out there, and she wasn't going away. I realized then that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't real, that this wasn't happening. The woman, the doppelganger, had some kind of hold over me, and I didn't know how to break free. I stayed up that night, every light in my apartment on, the door locked, every window sealed shut. The silence in the apartment felt oppressive, and I could still hear that voice in my head, the voice of the woman who looked like me. "You can't run forever, Olivia. I will always be here." The words echoed in my mind, sending a shiver down my spine. No matter what I did, no matter how far I went, she was always there. She was a part of me, and I was a part of her. And the worst part? I wasn't sure anymore who was the real one. Who was the original, and who was the copy? I didn't know how to escape the nightmare, and I'm starting to think that maybe there is no escape at all. Perhaps she's not trying to replace me. Maybe she's already done it. My name is Grace, and what I'm about to tell you is the most terrifying experience of my life. It's a story I've never shared with anyone because I'm not sure if anyone would believe me. Sometimes, I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I know this much. What happened to me was real, and it changed everything. It started one night, not long after my 16th birthday. I had been out with friends at a local diner, laughing and talking like we usually did. It was the kind of night that made me feel alive. Nothing extraordinary, just the simple joy of being with people I cared about. But as I walked home that evening, the wind had picked up, and the streets were quieter than usual. The streetlights flickered in and out, casting strange shadows on the pavement. I lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, not far from the woods. It was peaceful but also a little eerie at night, with nothing but the rustling trees and the occasional hoot of an owl to break the silence. As I neared the end of the block, I began to feel like something wasn't quite right. It was that feeling, like someone was watching you, even though you couldn't see anyone around. I quickened my pace, brushing off the unease that had settled in my stomach. I reached my front door and unlocked it, stepping inside quickly, feeling a strange sense of relief as I closed the door behind me. The house was silent, and my parents had already gone to bed. I was used to the quiet, but tonight it felt different. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I went to my room, changed into my pajamas, and got into bed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My eyes kept drifting to the window, half expecting to see something moving out there in the dark. But there was nothing. I finally managed to fall asleep, but my rest was restless. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone moving in the hallway. At first, I thought it was my mom checking in on me, but as I listened more closely, I realized that it wasn't her footsteps. It was too light, almost silent, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I lay perfectly still, my heart beating in my chest as I listened to the footsteps grow louder. They were getting closer, right outside my door. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Then, I heard it, a soft knock at the door, just enough to send a chill down my spine. "Grace." The voice was almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like my mom, but there was something wrong about it. Her voice was lower, smoother, almost too smooth. I didn't respond. I was frozen with fear. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Grace." "It's me." Open the door. My mom had never sounded like that before. I could feel my palms sweating as I slowly got out of bed, my body shaking with every movement. I crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know who was on the other side. My mind was racing. What if something had happened to my mom? Why did she sound so different? I took a deep breath and swung the door open. Standing in the hallway was a woman, tall, dark hair, wearing a long, pale nightgown. But it wasn't my mom. It looked like her, but her face was slightly off. The eyes were too wide, too still, and her lips curled into a smile that was far too perfect, far too cold. I gasped and took a step back. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with those eerie, unblinking eyes. "Grace," she said again, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. "Why don't you want to let me in?" I shook my head, the words caught in my throat. "You're not my mom," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. The woman's smile faltered for just a second, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. It was anger, real, raw anger. And then it was gone, replaced by that unsettling smile again. "I am your mom, Grace. I'm the one who loves you, the one who's always been there." She stepped forward, slowly, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. "Why don't you want to let me in?" I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. The woman didn't move anymore. She just stared at me with those terrible eyes. I felt like she was trying to peel away everything I knew about myself, every bit of trust one had in my own memories. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My mind raced. What had just happened? That wasn't my mom. That wasn't anyone I knew. It was something else. Something wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening for any sounds, any sign that the woman was still outside my door. But nothing came. The house was silent again. I didn't feel safe. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me. The next day, I told myself it was just a nightmare. A terrible, vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the same face I had seen every day of my life. My reflection seemed off, like it was a few seconds behind, or maybe a few seconds ahead. I couldn't tell, and every time I looked at it, I felt that same unease creeping into my bones. As the days passed, the encounters became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of her, in reflections in windows, in the shadows of my room. At night, I'd hear soft whispers at the door, and sometimes I'd wake up to find something, or someone, standing at the foot of my bed. When I looked, they were always gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if it was always there, always watching, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. It was a Saturday afternoon when I saw it for the first time in full daylight. I had been in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when I felt the familiar sensation of being watched. I turned around, and there she was, the woman who looked like me. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at me with that same twisted smile. I froze. This time, there was no mistaking it. This wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow in the corner of my eye. This was real, and it was standing in front of me, looking at me as if it had all the time in the world. "I'm here," the woman said softly, her voice sending a chill through my body. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you, Grace?" I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from her. And then, she did something that made my heart stop. She reached up and touched her face, just like I was doing at that very moment. "You can't escape me," she whispered, and for the first time, I saw it, the truth. She wasn't just looking like me. She was me, but not the real me. She was a copy, a reflection, a doppelganger that had somehow stepped out of the mirror, out of the shadows, and into my life. That was when I understood. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't just a coincidence. She was here because she wanted to take my place, and she was getting closer. I don't know how much time passed, but I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of the house. I had to leave before it took over everything. I grabbed my things and ran, but as I looked behind me one last time, I saw her, me, standing in the doorway, watching me with those cold eyes, that unblinking smile. "I'll see you soon, Grace," she whispered, and I knew then that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape her. She was already inside me. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she's out there, waiting for me to come back. But one thing is certain, I'll never be the same, because the other me is still out there, and she's getting closer every day. I've never believed in supernatural things. I used to think all those ghost stories and tales about monsters under the bed were just for kids. Silly, made-up things that adults should know better than to believe in. But that all changed when I saw her. I was 17 years old at the time. My family had recently moved into a small, two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of place I would have chosen, but I didn't have much say in the matter. My parents were thrilled with the change, excited to get out of the city and settle somewhere a little more peaceful. I was less enthusiastic. Moving meant leaving behind my friends, my school, and the comfort of familiarity. The house we moved into was old, probably over 100 years old, but it had its charm. It was big enough for us to spread out, and there was a small garden in the back that my mom was especially fond of. It wasn't perfect, but I could live with it. At least, that's what I thought. The first night in the house felt strange, like stepping into someone else's life. Everything was so quiet, so still. The house had a lot of creaks and groans, and at first, I thought that was just because it was old. But over time, the house started to feel less like a home and more like a place I was just passing through. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. One afternoon, a couple of weeks after we'd moved in, I was upstairs in the bathroom. It was a small room, with a large mirror on the wall above the sink. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I noticed something strange in the reflection. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it again. Someone standing just behind me in the mirror. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection was still there, looking exactly as it should, except something wasn't right. My reflection in the mirror was smiling, but I wasn't smiling. I took a step back, my mind racing to explain what I was seeing. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. A weird shadow from the window. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, my heart kept pounding in my chest. I could still see her in the reflection, her, a version of me that wasn't me. The longer I stood there, the more I started to feel like something was wrong. The smile in the mirror grew wider, almost unnatural, and my reflection seemed to move independently from me. I turned away quickly, not wanting to look at it anymore, but I could still feel that presence lingering behind me. I don't know how long I stood there before I could finally tear myself away, but I know that when I left the bathroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just stress from the move, that I was imagining things. But then, it happened again. I was in my room, unpacking some of my old things. I looked up at the mirror hanging on the opposite wall. For just a second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, something that wasn't me. I blinked, but when I looked again, everything seemed normal. But that feeling was back. It was like she was there, just behind me, watching me, waiting. At night, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. It wasn't just in the bathroom or my room. It felt like it was everywhere. I'd be lying in bed, trying to sleep, and I would feel like I wasn't alone. Like someone was standing in the doorway or hovering just outside my window. Every creak in the house made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. I went to the bathroom again, determined to look into the mirror and face whatever I had been avoiding. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. For a long time, nothing happened. My face was calm, expressionless. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but once again, there was nothing there. My room was empty, just as it should be. But when I turned back to the mirror, she was there again. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was glaring at me. Her eyes were wide and dark, and there was a twisted, malicious expression on her face. My reflection wasn't just looking at me, it was mocking me, and suddenly, I understood what she was. She wasn't just some weird trick of light or shadow. She was something else, something darker. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The reflection in the mirror didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, watching me, but I could feel her presence in every part of the room. It was like she was right behind me, close enough to touch. "Leave me alone," I shouted, but the reflection didn't respond. I ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my head spinning with fear and confusion. What was happening to me? Why was she doing this? Why was she trying to take over my life? The next day, I decided to tell my parents. I didn't want to, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I was terrified. I explained everything to them. How I saw someone in the mirror who wasn't me, how I felt like I was being watched. At first, they didn't believe me. My mom laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. My dad didn't say much, but he looked concerned. I think he just didn't want to acknowledge what I was saying. But that night, something happened that made me wish I had never said anything. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my room. Soft, slow footsteps, like someone was creeping down the hallway. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I heard a voice, my voice. "Grace?" It called softly, almost like a whisper. I was paralyzed with fear. My own voice, calling out to me from outside my door. "Grace, let me in," the voice repeated. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should answer, if I should open the door. My head was spinning with panic, and I felt like I was trapped in my own nightmare. "Please, Grace," the voice said again, and this time, I could hear the desperation in it. "You know I'm your real mom, don't you? Open the door." But it wasn't my mom. It couldn't be. I stayed silent, my hands trembling at my sides. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear the sound of scratching at the door. It was like something was trying to get in. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the room, straight into the hallway. My parents' door was cracked open, and I could see that they were both asleep, completely unaware of what was going on. But when I turned back to my room, I saw her. The woman in the mirror. My reflection. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes glowing in the dark. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was watching me with a look of pure hatred. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped between reality and whatever nightmare this thing had dragged me into. And then, just like that, she vanished. I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember anything clearly. All I know is that when I woke up, the house was silent again. The mirror was just a mirror, but I could still feel her presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next time I would slip up. I don't know how to explain it, but I know one thing for sure. She is still out there. She is waiting, and sooner or later, I know she will return. And when she does, I don't know if I'll be able to stop her from taking over, but I won't let her win. I can't, because if I do, I won't just lose my life. I'll lose myself.